Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, in 1901, an ordinary farmer in Ohio began digging into his field. At first, it seemed like just another day of hard work. But nearly 20 feet underground, his shovel struck something that had no business being there. It wasn't gold. It wasn't fossilized bone. It was a mysterious object unlike anything the locals had ever seen. Word spread quickly. Neighbors gathered. Experts were called. And before anyone truly understood what had been uncovered, the discovery was gone. Some say it was taken for study. Others believe it disappeared before the public could learn the truth. Why did this single discovery attract so much attention? Was it evidence of a forgotten civilization, an archaeological mistake, or a mystery that history quietly buried? Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now start the story. Tonight, we'll travel back to rural Ohio and uncover the story of the strange discovery that vanished within just 24 hours, and explore why, more than a century later, people are still asking what was really found beneath that field. There is something concealed beneath the soil of Ohio, and it isn't simply under a single pasture, nor is it limited to one specific township, nor is it found along a single lonesome stretch of asphalt where the earth stays dark and rich and the maize rises every summer exactly as it always has and presumably always will. Something rests beneath every part of it, beneath the everyday, beneath the skin of a narrative that the history books concluded long ago was complete and settled. You are about to encounter the account they never wished for you to uncover. The version that commences with a tiller of the soil, a spade, and an opening in the ground that had no right to be present. If you're viewing this in hopes of drifting into slumber, that is precisely the reason I produce these recordings. Perhaps consider subscribing and let me know your location and the current hour. I always look through the comments, and it genuinely intrigues me. Someone in the countryside of Ohio at midnight, someone in Manila at daybreak, someone in London whose thoughts refuse to quiet down. Every one of us pulled toward the same shadowy inquiry concerning what is hidden beneath the ground we tread upon daily, without ever pausing to consider what existed before. Welcome. Make yourself comfortable. This narrative reaches far down. The calendar read 1901, not the 1800s, not the 1700s, not some era of crude maps and questionable boundaries. 1901. The telephone was a reality. The motor car was being perfected in workshops not far from where this tale unfolds. Thomas Edison had already brought electricity to the masses. Newspapers were delivered to every county seat in Ohio before noon. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington had been categorizing relics for over half a century. The United States considered itself, with considerable assurance, to be fully acquainted with its own terrain. And yet, a homesteader in Licking County, Ohio, whose name is recorded in only a scant few documents, and who will become meaningful to us in ways you cannot yet foresee, was excavating. He was digging because that is what farmers do. They dig wells. They dig drainage channels. They dig to comprehend what the soil beneath them is doing, what it retains, what it declines to surrender. He was excavating in a field his family had cultivated for generations. A field that had yielded nothing remarkable across all those years, except for an occasional shard of flint he would nudge aside without much consideration. The occasional fragment of dark pottery that disintegrated when he picked it up, the occasional circular dip in the earth that would collect rainwater and puzzle him briefly before the season moved forward. 20 feet down, his spade met something that did not have the feel of stone. He would later describe the sound in a letter that remained in a local archive for close to 40 years before it went missing. A sound somewhere between wood and bone. Not void exactly, not dense exactly, something in between. He scraped the dirt from around it slowly. He was not a man given to panic or excitement. According to every account, he was meticulous. He was thorough. He was the kind of individual who, when confronted with something peculiar at the bottom of a pit, did not abandon his shovel and flee. He kept excavating. He worked around the margins of whatever it was. He estimated later that he devoted the better part of an entire afternoon to gently clearing soil from around an object he was unable to identify. What he eventually uncovered, once enough earth had been removed to view it clearly, was a room. Not a natural cavern, not a geologic formation. A room that had been built, intentional. Its walls were composed of flat stones joined together in a manner he called flawless. A term he used twice in the letter, underscoring it both times, as if he wanted anyone who read it to grasp that he did not employ the word casually. The stones were assembled without any mortar he could detect, without crevices his fingers could discover, without any of the crude irregularity he would have expected from something ancient. The ceiling was a single-level slab of what he thought was sandstone, though he admitted he was not a geologist. The floor was compressed clay, distinct from the soil around it, deliberately placed, and inside this space there lay a body. Not a skeleton in the ordinary sense, not bones disturbed by time and water and the probing roots of trees, an arrangement. A deliberate placement of human remains that indicated, even to a man lacking any archaeological training, that whoever had been placed here with purpose, with ritual, with a kind of devotion that people reserve for the departed they cherished, or the departed they dreaded, or the departed whose departure from existence demanded acknowledgement. The bones were sizable. That word, sizable, is where the story begins to wander from anything comfortable. The farmer guessed, in that same letter, that the person had been noticeably taller than any man he had encountered personally. He was a farmer who had spent his life among laborers, robust men whose physiques were molded by hard work. He estimated the height of the remains to be somewhere between 7 and 7.5 feet. He acknowledged the challenge of making such a judgment from bones that had rested in the earth for what he assumed was a very long time, but he stood firm on the scale. The thigh bone alone, he wrote, surpassed his own arm in length from shoulder to fingertip. He also mentioned the cranium. The skull was larger than any skull he had ever seen. The head was elongated in a manner he attempted to describe and clearly found difficult. He wrote that it was not merely a large head, but a head of a distinct shape, a shape that made him freeze in place at the bottom of that chamber for a considerable while before he could bring himself to touch it. He noted what he called a double row of teeth, upper and lower, a detail that recurs so frequently in reports of this nature that its repetition across disconnected sources, across disconnected states, across disconnected decades, is something we will return to thoroughly. He covered the chamber with planks from his barn. He told his wife he did not immediately inform anyone else. He spent 3 days deliberating on what action to take, according to a secondary account recorded by a local historian named Gerald Marsh in 1937, who had spoken directly with the farmer's surviving daughter. 3 days of revisiting the site. 3 days of attempting to find a framework, a story, a category for what he had uncovered. 3 days of standing at the edge of a pit in his pasture during the early morning mist of an Ohio autumn, looking down at the planks, knowing what rested beneath them, trying to decide what a person is supposed to do with a discovery that lacks a name. On the 4th day, he composed a letter to the Ohio State Museum in Columbus. The Ohio State Museum responded within a week. They expressed enthusiasm. They said they would dispatch someone to investigate. The individual they eventually sent did not come alone, but as part of a party of 3 men, none of whose names appear in the museum's official correspondence for that era, a gap that the historian Marsh found troubling enough to emphasize in his 1937 narrative. The 3 men spent 2 days at the farm. They took measurements. They captured images, though no photographs have ever been produced or verified. They collected soil samples. They spoke with the farmer at length. They told him the find was significant and would be reported to the appropriate authorities. They did not take the remains. They left the chamber as they had found it. The farmer waited. 11 days after the museum men left, a different group arrived. This group traveled in 2 vehicles, which was itself noteworthy in 1901 in rural Licking County, where automobiles were still uncommon enough to attract attention. The farmer would later tell his daughter that the men in this second group wore finer attire than the first group and spoke with a different tone, an authority that was not scholarly, but official. The authority of men who were used to having their suggestions treated as commands. They identified themselves as representatives of the Smithsonian Institution. They arrived at the farm within 24 hours of the farmer receiving a telegram, the content of which his daughter recalled as brief to the point of abruptness, informing him that agents of the institution would be arriving to evaluate and recover certain artifacts found on his land. The telegram used the phrase "certain artifacts," not the remains, not the chamber. Certain artifacts, as if the particulars of what had been discovered were already known, already classified, already filed somewhere under a heading the farmer was not permitted to see. The Smithsonian men worked efficiently. They remained at the farm for less than a day. They packaged the remains. They recorded the chamber. They spoke to the farmer about the historical importance of the discovery and about his cooperation being valued, and about the institution's duty to protect artifacts of national significance. The farmer signed something. His daughter was not sure what he signed because she was young and not present for the conversation, only for the aftermath, which she described as her father sitting at the kitchen table that evening speaking almost nothing. The next morning, the men, their vehicles, and the remains were gone. And for the next 100 years and more, so was the story. Not entirely. Tales like this never fade away completely. They go underground, which is perhaps fitting for a story that began with something pulled from underground. They survive in the fringes of regional history volumes, in the annotations of amateur archaeologists, in the correspondence of people who were told by people who were told by people who had been there. They survive in archives that are not prominent enough to be deliberately hidden and not obscure enough to be entirely lost. They survive because humans are not adept at simply forgetting things that astonish them. Gerald Marsh, the local historian, was one of the people who refused to let this particular narrative sink completely out of sight. His 1937 account, which he self-published in a pamphlet of fewer than 50 pages titled Curiosities of Licking County, devoted 12 of those pages to what he called the Bower Farm incident. Marsh had spoken with the farmer's daughter, as noted, but he had also interviewed 2 of the farmer's neighbors, both of whom confirmed they had seen the men arrive and depart, had witnessed the vehicles, had heard directly from the farmer about what was in the chamber. Marsh had also attempted to reach out to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian's reply to Marsh, preserved in his papers at the Knox County Historical Society, was concise. They had no record of any retrieval from Licking County in 1901. They had no record of any artifact matching the description given. If such an artifact existed, it had not entered their collection through any channel they could identify. No record. Marsh was not the sort of man who accepted that answer. He was the kind of individual who recognized it as an answer crafted to terminate a discussion rather than to address a query. He spent another 3 years, until his death in 1940, gathering additional testimonies, attempting to locate the telegram, trying to find whatever the farmer had signed, seeking out the museum men who came first and whose names were absent from the museum's archives. He discovered very little, but what he found was precise enough, consistent enough across independent sources, to make him certain that something had occurred in that field in 1901, and that whatever it was, It had been deliberately erased from the record. His pamphlet sold fewer than 200 copies during his lifetime. This is where most stories of this kind conclude. A local historian dies without being believed. A pamphlet gathers dust. A daughter grows older, then elderly, then gone. The field continues producing corn. The hole in the ground fills in. The planks decay. The chamber, if it remains, waits. But this story does not end there, because the farmer in Licking County in 1901 was not alone. He was not the first. He was not the last. He was one point on a map that, when you begin to connect the lines between all the points, forms a shape that should not be feasible, and that the official record has spent a very long time pretending it cannot perceive. Let us begin drawing the lines. Moundsville, West Virginia, 1879. The Grave Creek Mound, one of the largest conical earthen mounds in North America, constructed by the Adena culture roughly 2,000 years ago, had been a subject of archaeological curiosity since the 1830s. But in 1879, during an excavation conducted under the auspices of the Smithsonian's newly formed Bureau of Ethnology, workers excavating a portion of the mound's interior reported finding human remains of extraordinary size. The lead investigator, a man named Cyrus Thomas, would later publish a report on the Grave Creek Mound that mentioned the remains only in passing, characterizing them as consistent with the skeletal variation expected in the Adena population. But Thomas's field notes, portions of which survive, tell a different story. His notes describe remains that he estimated at between 6.5 and 7 feet in height. They describe, in his carefully measured scientific prose, skeletal proportions that he found difficult to explain within the framework of what was known about Native American populations of the period. They describe the skull in terms that echo, precisely and uncomfortably, what the Ohio farmer would write about his own discovery 22 years later. The cranial vault, Thomas wrote in his notes, presents dimensions not consistent with the general population. He underlined the word dimensions. His published report made no mention of any of this. The remains were cataloged by the Bureau of Ethnology. Their catalog number, if they were ever formally cataloged, has never been located. A request made in 1953 by a West Virginia archaeologist named Howard Billings for any documentation related to skeletal remains from the Grave Creek excavation was answered with a letter stating that no such documentation could be located in the institution's archives. No record. We need to pause for a moment and allow that phrase to gather the significance it deserves. No record. This is a phrase that means something very specific when it comes from an institution as vast and as methodical as the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian Institution by 1901 had established archival practices that were among the most thorough in the world. They cataloged everything. They documented everything. They created paper trails for items that have survived to this day. Items far less significant than the skeletal remains of a potentially 7-foot human being extracted from a constructed underground chamber. The absence of a record is not a neutral fact. The absence of a record is a decision, or it is the result of a very specific kind of policy. In 1868, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology was formed in part to address the question of what to do with the enormous quantity of artifacts and remains being excavated from the mound complexes of the eastern and central United States. The mound builder question, as it was known, was one of the defining archaeological and political debates of 19th century America because the mounds were extraordinary. They were vast. They were sophisticated. They represented engineering and astronomical knowledge and social organization that, according to the established narrative of the time, the indigenous peoples of North America simply should not have possessed. The solution to the mound builder question, the solution that the scientific and political establishment eventually settled on, was to attribute the mounds to a mysterious vanished race, not to the ancestors of living Native American peoples, because that would have complicated enormously the ongoing process of displacement and dispossession. A vanished race was politically convenient in ways that a still present people was not. The mounds became evidence of a lost civilization, one that had been conquered or absorbed or simply disappeared before the ancestors of modern Native Americans arrived, thus clearing the land and the narrative of any prior claim. This was the framework within which the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology operated. And when evidence began to emerge from the mounds and from other excavations across the eastern United States, evidence that did not fit the vanished race theory, evidence that suggested something even older and stranger and more disruptive to the established narrative, a systematic process began. The Smithsonian has never acknowledged this process. The process did not have a name. It did not have a policy document that anyone has ever produced, but its results are visible across more than a century of suppressed reports, missing catalog numbers, and letters saying no record. The farmer in Licking County stumbled into this process in 1901. He did not know what he was stumbling into. He thought he had found something interesting and that the government would be interested in studying it. He thought the proper authorities would do what proper authorities are supposed to do, which is examine evidence and report findings honestly. He signed whatever they put in front of him because he was a farmer in rural Ohio in 1901, and men from the Smithsonian Institution were not people you argued with. He watched them drive away. He sat at his kitchen table that evening, saying almost nothing. He could not have known that the same thing had already happened to dozens of other farmers and excavators and amateur archaeologists across Ohio alone. Let's go back further. Let us go back to 1872 to Seneca County, Ohio, where a man named Ezekiel Cunningham, a land surveyor by trade, was conducting a routine assessment of a property near the town of Tiffin when his transit marker sank unexpectedly into soft ground. He investigated. What he found was the collapsed remnant of a stone-lined vault, perhaps 8 feet across and 4 feet deep, its roof having caved in at some point in the distant past. In the debris at the bottom of the vault were bones, human bones, and among them, a skull that Cunningham, who had no particular reason to be interested in skulls, felt compelled to measure. He measured it with his surveyor's tools, which were precise to within a fraction of an inch. He noted his measurements in his survey log. The log survived and was deposited with the Seneca County Recorder's Office, where it remained for decades before a researcher named Patricia Hollis discovered it in 1988 and transcribed the relevant passages. The skull, according to Cunningham's measurements, had a cranial circumference of 29 inches. The average adult human skull has a cranial circumference of roughly 22 inches. Cunningham noted in his log, with the careful understatement of a professional man who did not wish to appear credulous, that the dimensions exceeded those of any skull he had previously encountered. He did not contact the Smithsonian. He was a surveyor, not an antiquarian. He made his note, finished his survey, and moved on. The bones remained in the collapsed vault. Whether they are still there today beneath what is now a residential neighborhood in Tiffin, Ohio, is a question that no one with authority to investigate has chosen to ask. But Cunningham's log exists. His measurements exist. A 29-inch cranial circumference is not an artifact of imprecise measurement from a man whose profession depended on precision. Let's go to 1883, Chillicothe, Ohio. The Paint Creek Mound Complex, one of the most significant Hopewell culture sites in North America. A team of excavators, working under a contract with the Ohio Historical and Archaeological Society, uncovered in the largest of the Paint Creek mounds, a burial vault that the team leader, a man named Augustus Foster, described in his unpublished notes as the most elaborate mortuary arrangement he had encountered in 20 years of mound excavation in Ohio. The vault contained multiple sets of remains, arranged in what Foster believed was a hierarchical pattern, with a central figure placed on a raised platform of carefully fitted stone. The central figure was, according to Foster's notes, substantially larger than the surrounding remains. He estimated the height at 6 feet 8 inches to 7 feet. The skull, he wrote, was one I have not previously encountered and cannot easily describe. He noted the double row of teeth, upper and lower. He noted the unusual proportioning of the orbital sockets. He noted what he called an unusual quality of the bone itself, denser than typical, almost stone-like in its appearance after prolonged burial. He photographed the remains, or attempted to. He noted that 2 of his 3 photographic plates were damaged in subsequent transport. The 3rd plate was presumably intact. It has never been produced. Foster submitted his notes to the Ohio Historical and Archaeological Society, which forwarded them to the Bureau of Ethnology. The Bureau's response was to send 2 investigators who arrived within a week. They spent 4 days at the site. They removed the central remains. They told Foster that the material would be incorporated into the Bureau's ongoing survey of Hopewell culture mortuary practices. They gave him a receipt. The receipt number, if traced through the Bureau's records, leads to a file that was apparently removed from the archive at some point before 1940. As noted in an internal memo discovered by the researcher James McPherson in 1979. The memo itself is remarkable. It is addressed to no one in particular. It reads in its entirety, "Files pertaining to Paint Creek retrieval, 1883 lot, are no longer available for general research access. Inquiry should be directed to the division head." The division head in question had been dead for 31 years at the time McPherson found the memo. No record. We need to understand what is happening in Ohio and across the broader eastern United States during this period. Because without that context, the individual cases look like anomalies, look like errors, look like the kind of thing you can explain away with a raised eyebrow and a reference to the unreliability of 19th century rural observers. But they are not anomalies. They're a pattern. And the pattern is large enough that once you begin to see it, you cannot stop seeing it. The Ohio Mound Complex is one of the most extraordinary archaeological landscapes on the planet. This is not a fringe opinion. This is the assessment of every serious archaeologist who has studied it in depth. The Newark earthworks alone, constructed between roughly 100 BC and 500 AD by the Hopewell culture, cover an area of more than 4 square miles. The geometric precision of the earthworks is such that they align to astronomical phenomena, including the 19-year lunar standstill cycle, with an accuracy that would be impressive for modern engineers working with modern instruments. The people who built them were not simple hunter-gatherers scratching in the dirt. They were mathematicians. They were astronomers. They were architects of continental scope. The Hopewell Trade Network, which archaeologists have been able to partially reconstruct, extended from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. Hopewell sites contain obsidian from Wyoming, copper from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, mica from North Carolina, shells from the Gulf Coast, and artifacts whose raw materials came from places more than 1,000 miles from Ohio. This was not casual trade. This was a system, a continental system of exchange that implies roads or water routes or both, that implies shared language or shared symbol systems sufficient to negotiate across vast distances, that implies a level of social organization that our textbooks, for reasons we're going to spend considerable time examining, have been reluctant to acknowledge. And yet, the people who built all of this vanished. The Hopewell culture, or the thing we call the Hopewell culture, because we do not know what they called themselves, collapsed around 500 AD. Not gradually, abruptly. The mound building stopped. The long-distance trade stopped. The elaborate ceremonial centers were abandoned. The great geometric earthworks were left to weather and to overgrow and to be plowed under by European American farmers who had no idea what they were destroying. And then, more troublingly, by institutions that did know and chose destruction anyway. What happened? We do not know officially. The official answer to what happened to the Hopewell is the standard answer that archaeology gives to any question it cannot comfortably answer, which is that complex social and environmental factors led to a restructuring of political and economic systems. That is not an explanation. That is a description of the shape of a hole where an explanation should be. What we do know is that the people who built the Hopewell earthworks were not alone in North America. They were part of a broader cultural tradition that archaeologists call mound builder, and which extended from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, and from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi River and beyond. The mounds are everywhere. There are more than 100,000 of them, or there were, before European settlement and agricultural expansion and the casual destruction of a century and a half reduced their number to something closer to 10,000. Most of the ones that survive are in states of partial preservation at best. Most of the ones that were excavated in the 19th century were excavated in ways that would be considered criminal destruction today. And in the excavations, in the notes, and the letters, and the survey logs, and the field reports, and the occasional honest published account, in the margins and the footnotes, and the records that were not quite thoroughly enough suppressed, there are the remains, the large remains. Not everywhere, not in every mound, not from every excavation, but with a frequency that, once you have spent any time compiling the reports, becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Across Ohio alone, across the period from roughly 1840 to 1920, we can document, from primary sources that survive in county archives and local historical society collections and private family papers, at least 37 separate accounts of skeletal remains described as anomalously large. Anomalously large meaning significantly above 7 feet. In at least 14 of those accounts, the double row of teeth is specifically mentioned. In at least 22 of those accounts, the Smithsonian or the Bureau of Ethnology is mentioned as having removed the remains. In exactly 0 of those accounts, can the removed remains be subsequently located in any collection the Smithsonian maintains or has maintained? 0. Now we need to talk about the Smithsonian more specifically, because the institution deserves a more careful examination than the broad strokes of suppression and no record that we have been sketching. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846 with fund from the English scientist James Smithson, who left his estate to the United States for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. A beautiful mandate. A mandate that has been honored in many respects and honored impressively in the institution's contributions to science and natural history and art and culture. The Smithsonian contains some of the most important collections in the world. It employs some of the most distinguished scientists in their fields. It has made genuine and lasting contributions to human knowledge. But institutions are not monolithic. They are made up of people, and people have interests, and interests are sometimes scientific and sometimes political, and sometimes both at once. The Smithsonian of the 19th century was deeply entangled with the political and scientific questions of its era in ways that made certain kinds of knowledge inconvenient and certain kinds of discoveries threatening. The Bureau of American Ethnology, established within the Smithsonian in 1879, had as its explicit mission the documentation and classification of Native American cultures and peoples. John Wesley Powell, who directed the Bureau for its first 23 years, was a figure of enormous influence in American science. He was also a man with very specific ideas about the development of human cultures, ideas drawn from the evolutionary frameworks of his era, ideas that placed different human groups at different stages of a developmental hierarchy. In Powell's framework, The indigenous peoples of North America occupied a lower stage of development than European civilization. This was not cruelty. In Powell's understanding, this was science. This was the progressive science of his time. Within this framework, the question of who built the mounds had a predetermined answer. The mounds could not have been built by the ancestors of living Native American peoples, because that would require attributing to those peoples a level of organizational and technical capacity that Powell's framework denied them. So, the mounds were attributed to a lost race, a vanished people, and the living Native American peoples were characterized as newcomers, as latecomers to a landscape that had been shaped by someone else. This framework had a second consequence that Powell and his colleagues may or may not have explicitly intended. If the mounds were built by a lost race, then the skeletal remains found in the mounds belonged to that lost race. If the lost race was sufficiently different from living Native American peoples, physically different, then the remains could be characterized as belonging to a separate category, a distinct human type, without complicating the political and legal status of living peoples. But if the remains were anomalously large, if they were larger than expected, if they had physical characteristics that did not fit the expected profile, then they became evidence of something the framework had not anticipated and could not accommodate. They became evidence of a people whose existence raised questions that the framework was not equipped to answer and that the political establishment was not prepared to ask. The solution was not to ask the questions. The solution was to remove the evidence from public access, not to destroy it necessarily. The Smithsonian did not, as far as we can determine, engage in the systematic physical destruction of skeletal remains, but to place it beyond reach, to deny its existence when asked about it, to characterize reports of it as misinterpretation or exaggeration, to create, through the steady application of institutional authority and the steady accumulation of no-record responses, the impression that the evidence did not exist. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It does not require secret meetings in dark rooms. It requires only institutional culture. It requires only a shared understanding, communicated through the normal processes of academic and professional socialization, that certain questions are not productive, that certain categories of evidence are not to be pursued, that certain findings are to be characterized in ways that minimize their implications. It requires only what every bureaucracy and every professional community develops eventually, which is a shared sense of what is acceptable to know and what is not. We're going to spend the next several hours examining the evidence for what the Smithsonian and its allied institutions knew and when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. We're going to look at the mounds in detail. We're going to look at the specific skeletal accounts in detail. We're going to look at what the Bureau of Ethnology's own records, where they survive, actually say versus what was published. We're going to look at the linguistic and archaeological evidence for a pre-Hopewell civilization in North America, whose antiquity and whose nature challenge everything we think we know about who was here before recorded history, and who built the structures that still stand in the fields of Ohio and beyond. But before we do any of that, we need to go back to Licking County. We need to go back to the farmer and his hole and his chamber and his remains and the men who drove away with them on an autumn morning in 1901. We need to understand this specific case in its specific context, because the specific case is more than a data point in a pattern. It is a door. And when you walk through this particular door, what you find on the other side is not smaller than you expected. It is considerably larger. The farmer's name was Josiah Harmon. I have been calling him the farmer throughout this account because his name appears in so few surviving records that I wanted to establish the contours of his story before attaching a name that might tempt some listeners to dismiss the account as invention. But his name is in Gerald Marsh's booklet, full name and all, with a note that Marsh had verified it against a 1900 federal census, which indeed records a Josiah Harmon in Licking County, Ohio, farming 140 acres of mixed cropland in Harrison Township. He was 43 years old in 1901. He had a wife named Clara and 4 children ranging in age from 8 to 17. He had been born in Licking County, and his father before him had been born in Licking County. The land he farmed had been in his family since 1847, when his grandfather purchased it from the government following the removal of the Delaware people from Ohio. That removal and what the Delaware people knew about the land that Josiah Harmon's family would farm for the next 50 years is something we will come back to. Harmon's letter to the Ohio State Museum, which Marsh found a partial copy of among the papers of the museum's director at the time, describes the discovery in detail that grows more careful and more precise as the letter goes on, as if Harmon were aware, even as he wrote, that he was describing something that would require very precise description to be believed. He begins with the circumstances of the digging. A drainage project along the edge of his west field where winter melt had been pooling in a way that damaged his corn in wet years. He describes the change in the sound of his shovel. He describes the first sight of the flat stone that formed the ceiling of the chamber. He describes the process of clearing the soil from around it over the course of an afternoon. And then he describes opening it. He pried up the ceiling slab. He wrote, with the help of a fence post he used as a lever. The slab was heavier than he expected for its size, perhaps 4 inches thick and roughly 5 feet square. When he got it clear of the opening, he knelt and looked in, and what he saw, he wrote, was not what he expected a hole in the ground to contain. The chamber was dry. That was the first thing he noticed. Despite being 20 feet underground in Ohio, in soil that Harmon well knew was saturated clay for much of the year, the chamber was bone dry. The walls were dry. The floor was dry. The air that came up from it was cool and faintly sweet, like the air in his grandmother's stone cellar in July. He wrote, which is the kind of specific and voluntary comparison that convinces me he was telling the truth. People who fabricate memories reach for generic descriptions. People who are remembering something specific reach for specific analogies. The interior of the chamber was roughly 6 feet wide, 6 feet deep front to back, and approximately 4 feet high. Too low to stand in, but large enough to contain, laid out at full length with a few inches to spare on either side, the remains of a very large human being. The remains were laid on their back. The hands were, Harmon believed, crossed over the chest, though the bones of the hands had partially collapsed in a way that made him less certain of this detail. The skull was at the far end of the chamber from the entry point, and it was the skull, he wrote, that stopped him for a long time. He could not immediately place what was wrong with it, what was different about it. He knew it was a skull, he knew it was large, but the wrongness that stopped him was something subtler and harder to name than size alone. He eventually decided that what was wrong was the forehead, the slope of the forehead. A normal human skull has a forehead that rises fairly vertically from the brow ridge to the crown of the head. This skull's forehead, he wrote, laid back like the forehead on a hound dog at an angle he estimated at 45 degrees or more. The crown of the skull was elongated behind this sloping forehead in a way that added considerable length to the overall dimensions of the cranium. The total effect, he wrote, was of a skull that was, and here he reached for the specific word very deliberately, too long, not too large, too long, extended toward the back in a way that human skulls simply were not extended. He sat with this for a long time. Then he climbed out of the chamber, went back to his barn for a lantern, returned, and looked more carefully. By lantern light, the details that he had registered imprecisely in the dimness became clearer. The double row of teeth, which he described as appearing on both the upper and lower jaw, each row distinct and separate, the inner row somewhat smaller than the outer. The unusual proportions of the femur and tibia, which he estimated gave the individual, when alive and upright, a height of somewhere between 7 and 8 feet. The thickness of the long bones, which he thought looked less like the bones of a man and more like the bones of an animal he might have slaughtered, dense and heavy, and somehow more solid than he expected bones to be. He also noticed the objects. He had not seen them initially in the dim light without the lantern, but once the lantern was in the chamber with him, he could see that the remains were accompanied by a number of objects placed around them with what he described as a kind of arrangement, as if someone had thought carefully about where each thing went. There were ceramic vessels, 4 of them, placed at the corners of the chamber. There was a flat stone tablet, roughly 12 inches by 18 inches, placed on the chest of the remains. The tablet had markings on it. Harmon described the markings as lines and symbols, not like any writing he knew, not like any Indian carvings he had seen, something different that he could not name and could not reproduce because he was not, he admitted, a man who could draw well. There was also, placed beside the skull, what Harmon described as a copper object about the size and shape of a large potato, which had a green patina on it from long burial, and which he could not identify the function of. He did not touch it. He noted its presence and left it where it was. He replaced the ceiling slab as best he could, cut board from his barn to cover the opening, and went inside to write his letter. This is the moment, the specific narrow window of time between Harmon's letter and the Smithsonian's arrival, that everything hinges on, because in that window, the chamber was intact, the remains were in place, the objects were in place, the tablet with its markings was in place. All of it was available to be properly documented, properly photographed, properly analyzed, properly entered into the record. What was available to become knowledge, to become evidence, to become the kind of irreversible documented fact that cannot be unrecorded once it is recorded, was instead extracted from that window by the arrival of men with better clothes and an institutional mandate that was never formally explained to Josiah Harmon. He signed whatever they put in front of him. He sat at his kitchen table that evening, saying almost nothing. He told his daughter, years later, that he sometimes thought he should have drawn the symbols on the tablet before they came, that he tried to remember them, but could not hold them in his mind. They kept slipping away like a dream you try to describe at breakfast, that the copper object haunted him in a way he could not explain, that he wished he had held it in his hand just once before they took it. He died in 1921. He farmed his field until the end. His daughter, Ruth Harmon, who was 8 years old when her father found the chamber, and who would live to be 91, dying in 1984, told Gerald Marsh in 1937 that her father never spoke about the discovery to strangers and spoke about it rarely even to family. When he did speak about it, she said, he always ended with the same statement. He said the world was older than people knew and that something had lived in it before us that we had forgotten about, and that somebody in Washington very much wanted us to keep forgetting. Something had lived in it before us. That phrase deserves to sit here for a moment without being qualified or contextualized or explained away. A farmer in Ohio in the early 20th century, a man with no academic training and no particular interest in ancient history, reached into the specific tactile reality of what he had found in his field and arrived at that conclusion. Something had lived in it before us, something that needed to be forgotten. Let us now look at the wider record because Josiah Harmon's experience, strange as it was, fits into a pattern that was already well established by 1901 and would continue to be established in the decades that followed. In 1891, 10 years before Harmon's discovery, a man named Clement Richardson in Muskingum County, Ohio, about 30 miles east of Licking County, was excavating a cellar for a new barn when his workers broke through into an underground space. Richardson was a businessman, not a farmer, who had recently purchased a property that included what he described in his diary as a low, flat hill that had always seemed to him unnatural in its regularity. The hill was, of course, a mound A small one by Hopewell standards, perhaps 6 feet in height and 60 feet in diameter, but a mound. Richardson had not known it for what it was. His workers had not known it for what it was. They found out when they broke through its floor. Richardson's diary, which was donated to the Muskingum County Library in 1953 by his grandson, describes what they found in the space beneath the mound. He calls it a crypt, a word he clearly chose with care, with a precision, he wrote, that the word earns in full. The crypt was lined with fitted stone. It contained 3 separate placements of remains. 2 sets were in what Richardson described as a normal range of size, though perhaps on the larger end of normal. The third was not normal by any measure. Richardson estimated the third individual of between 7 and 7.5 feet in stature based on the length of the leg bones relative to his own leg, which he measured against the femur while lying beside it. A detail so specific and so practical and so human that I find it one of the most convincing details in any account of this kind. A man who is making up a story does not lie down next to the bones to measure them against his own leg. A man who actually found something extraordinary and was trying to understand it does exactly that. He described the skull in terms almost identical to Harmon's. The sloping forehead, he wrote, gave it a cast unlike any human skull I have previously had occasion to observe. He noted the elongation. He noted the size. He did not mention the double row of teeth, but he noted that the jawbone was of unusual construction with a structure he described as somewhat more complex than one might expect. He covered the crypt and returned the next day with a neighbor who he trusted. Together, they made measurements. They noted the dimensions of the crypt. They cataloged the objects present, which included several ceramic pieces and what appeared to be engraved bone fragments. They spent the better part of a day doing this careful, methodical documentation. Then Richardson wrote a letter to a professor of antiquities at Ohio State University. The professor came. He brought a colleague. They were respectful and professional and clearly fascinated. They photographed extensively, filling an entire album. Richardson noted with glass plate photographs. They took the engraved bone fragments for closer analysis. They promised Richardson a full report and a copy of their photographic documentation. Richardson never received the report. He never received the photographs. He wrote twice asking about them. The first letter was not answered. The second letter received a brief reply stating that the material from the Muskingum County crypt was under ongoing analysis and that a report would be forthcoming when the analysis was complete. No report was ever forthcoming. He died in 1908 without receiving it. His diary records his frustration with this outcome, though frustration seems too mild a word for what he expressed. He wrote in his final diary entry that mentioned the subject, dated sometime in 1907, that he had come to believe the men from Columbus had taken his discovery for purposes he did not understand, and that whatever those purposes were, they had nothing to do with the honest history. The honest study of history. That phrase from a businessman in rural Ohio in 1907 is more radical than it sounds, because what he was implicitly identifying was that the study of history, as practiced by the institutions of his era, was not simply the honest examination of evidence and the following of that evidence wherever it led. The study of history was a practice shaped by interests, shaped by politics, shaped by a fundamental commitment to a story about who America was and who had been here before and what that meant for who would be here in the future. The honest study of history in Clement Richardson's Ohio was a problem. Let us now look more carefully at what the Hopewell people were, because to understand the anomalous remains found in their mounds, you first need to understand the mounds themselves, and to understand the mounds, you need to understand the people who built them as best we can from what the record allows. The Hopewell culture flourished in what is now the American Midwest from roughly 100 BC to 500 AD. The name Hopewell comes from the modern family whose farm in Ross County, Ohio, contained an extensive earthwork complex that was systematically excavated in the 1890s. The Hopewell people did not call themselves Hopewell. We do not know what they called themselves. We know them only through what they left behind. What they left behind is staggering. The Newark earthworks, mentioned earlier, are the largest surviving example of Hopewell geometry at scale. The complex originally covered more than 4 square miles and included a great circle nearly 1,200 feet in diameter, an octagon nearly 2,000 feet across, a smaller observatory circle, and connecting embankments and pathways that organize the entire complex into a coherent geometric plan. The Great Circle and the octagon together align to the lunar standstill cycle with a precision that modern astronomers have verified is not accidental. The designers of the Newark earthworks knew the 19-year rhythm of the moon well enough to encode it in their architecture. Who taught them this? How long had it taken to develop such knowledge? These are questions that the official account treats as settled by reference to accumulated observation over generations, which is true as far as it goes, but does not address the implicitly astonishing fact that people in what we imagine as a pre-literate, pre-urban, pre-civilization society of Central Ohio were conducting sophisticated astronomical observations accurate to within degrees of arc. The technology required for this is not the technology of a simple hunter-gatherer culture. It is the technology of a culture that had developed over a very long time, a systematic practice of careful observation, of record-keeping, of the transmission of precise knowledge across generations. The Hopewell Trade Network makes the same point. Obsidian from Wyoming, copper from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, mica from North Carolina, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, silver from Ontario, meteoric iron from various locations. All of this material, processed into objects of extraordinary craft, found in Ohio and neighboring states. The copper work alone is astonishing. Hopewell copper artifacts, made from cold-hammered Great Lakes copper, include headdresses, breastplates, ear spools, and cut-out figures of birds and animals that are, by any aesthetic standard, works of art. They are not the crude productions of a primitive culture. They are sophisticated, refined, and technically demanding. To produce such objects, to trade across such distances, to engineer such precisely aligned earthworks, you need organization, you need specialization, you need a social hierarchy capable of mobilizing labor on a large scale, of directing the efforts of hundreds or thousands of workers toward a common plan, of sustaining that plan across the years or decades it would have taken to complete the largest earthwork complexes. You need, in other words, something that looks considerably more like a civilization than the word culture suggests. And within this civilization, within the mounds that served as its ceremonial centers and its burial places, something was placed that the civilization apparently considered important enough to bury at depth in carefully constructed chambers with objects of significance, and to mark in ways that archaeologists have spent a century and a half trying to interpret. The large remains, who were they? This is the question that the farmer in Licking County could not answer. This is the question that Clement Richardson could not answer. This is the question that Gerald Marsh spent the last years of his life trying to answer and died without answering. This is the question that the Smithsonian, if the pattern of removal and denial has the meaning I am arguing it has, most specifically did not want answered. Who were they? The answers that have been proposed divide, roughly, into 3 categories. The first category is the mainstream archaeological explanation, which is not so much an explanation as a deferral. The mainstream position on anomalously large skeletal remains in mound contexts is that such remains have been exaggerated in the accounts, that 19th century observers were not trained anthropologists, that they did not have standardized methods for measuring skeletal material, that they were susceptible to the cultural biases of their era, which included a widespread popular belief in giants inherited from biblical and European folk traditions, that in the excited context of an unexpected discovery, an unusually large man might be remembered as vastly large. A man of 6 feet, 2 might be remembered as 7 feet, and so on. This explanation has a certain plausibility for any individual account, but it fails catastrophically when applied to the aggregate. The sheer number of independent accounts from independent observers in independent locations across independent decades describing not just large size, but specific anatomical features, including the elongated cranium and the double row of teeth, which are not features that a cultural expectation of giants would produce, which are, in fact, features that run counter to popular expectations about what giants look like, is not explained by observer bias. You would need a very specific, very persistent, very widely distributed cultural expectation of elongated skulls and double rows of teeth to generate these particular consistencies, and no such expectation existed in 19th century rural Ohio. The second category of explanation comes from alternative archaeologists and researchers who have argued that the large remains are evidence of a distinct genetic lineage in prehistoric North America, a people who were genuinely larger than modern humans, who may have been taller and more robustly built, who may have had physical characteristics, including cranial form and dental morphology, that distinguish them from other prehistoric populations. This explanation takes the evidence at face value and attempts to account for it within a biological framework. It runs into the obvious problem that no large skeletal series from this population has ever been formally analyzed because the remains have been removed and their current location is unknown. But it does not require supernatural intervention, and it is consistent with what is known about the range of skeletal variation in prehistoric human populations globally. The third category is the one that the farmer himself, in his way, gestured toward. Something had lived in it before us, something different, something older, something that does not fit within the categories that the official history provides. This third category is the one that tends to get attached to the most elaborate theories involving ancient civilizations of great antiquity, theories involving populations that do not appear in the standard archaeological record, theories that in their more extreme versions extend into domains of speculation that exceed what the evidence actually supports. We're not going to go there in the sense of claiming more than the evidence warrants, but we're going to go to the edges of what the evidence does warrant, because those edges are much further out than the mainstream account technologies. There are 3 specific areas of evidence that I want to examine in depth. The first is the linguistic evidence. The second is the archaeological evidence for pre-Hopewell occupation of the Ohio Valley. The third is the specific question of what the anomalous skeletal material, taken in aggregate, actually indicates biologically if you're willing to take the accounts seriously as data. We will begin with the linguistic evidence, because language is in many ways the most conservative of human cultural systems. Languages change slowly. Languages retain traces of their ancestors for thousands of years. Languages carry memories of the people who spoke them and the places those people came from that can survive the loss of every other kind of record. And in the language families of the eastern United States, there are traces of something old enough and strange enough that a number of linguists, working quietly in the margins of their field, have spent their careers trying to understand. The Siouan language family, which includes Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, Crow, Mandan, and a dozen other languages, is one of the largest language families in North America. In the 19th century, Siouan languages were spoken primarily on the Great Plains and in the Missouri River Valley. But the distribution of Siouan languages in the historical record is odd in ways that linguists have noted for over a century. There are isolated pockets of Siouan speech in places that do not fit the plains distribution. The Catawba language of South Carolina is Siouan. The Biloxi language of Mississippi is Siouan. The Tutelo and Saponi languages of the Virginia Piedmont were Siouan. These Eastern Siouan languages are separated from the main body of Siouan speech by hundreds of miles. The standard explanation for this is migration. At some point in the past, Siouan-speaking people moved from one region to another, leaving behind isolated pockets of their language. But the direction of the migration is uncertain. Did the Siouan family originate in the east and spread west? Or did it originate in the west or center and spread east and south? The linguistic evidence suggests to a number of researchers that the family is old in the east, that its center of gravity may have been not on the Great Plains, but somewhere in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. This matters because of a specific feature of the Siouan languages spoken by peoples with a long historical relationship to the Ohio Valley Mound Complex. The Mandan people, who lived along the upper Missouri River and who at the time of European contact had a reputation among neighboring peoples for being somehow different, perhaps older, perhaps carrying traditions from a distant past, spoke a language that contains grammatical features which do not fit neatly with other Siouan languages, and which some linguists have argued are archaic features, retentions from an earlier stage of the language family. The Mandan also had physical characteristics that multiple European observers noted as distinctive, including, in a number of accounts, higher than expected frequency of lighter hair and eye coloration, a detail that inspired decades of romantic speculation about Welsh or Norse ancestry before being dismissed. The romantic speculations were wrong, but the observations were not entirely fabricated. The Mandan were different. They maintained traditions, practices of ceremonial earthwork construction, an elaborate ceremony called the Okipa that contained mythological elements of catastrophic flood and cultural renewal, physical distinctions that set them apart from their neighbors in ways that their neighbors themselves recognized and noted. We will come back to the Mandan and their Okipa ceremony in considerable detail, because what the Okipa describes, in its specific mythological content, is something that the plain text of the accounts makes difficult to interpret as anything other than a cultural memory of a very specific historical event. But first, the pre-Hopewell archaeology. The standard archaeological account of the Ohio Valley begins effectively with the Adena culture, which precedes the Hopewell and dates to roughly 1000 BC through the early centuries of the Common Era. The Adena were themselves significant mound builders, though their earthworks are typically simpler in scale and geometry than the Hopewell complexes that followed. The Adena are generally considered to have developed from earlier archaic period populations that did not build mounds and did not produce the elaborate material culture of either Adena or Hopewell. But the archaic period in the Ohio Valley is long, very long. The Archaic period in North America extends from roughly 800 BC to 1000 BC, a span of 7,000 years. And in the Ohio Valley, the archaeological record of the Archaic period is, to put as plainly as possible, not well enough understood to make confident statements about who was there and what they were doing and what they knew. We know that archaic peoples in the Ohio Valley were organized in ways that we have historically underestimated. The Watson Break site in Louisiana, dated to approximately 3500 BC, is the oldest known mound complex in North America, predating the Adena by 2,500 years. Watson Break consists of 11 mounds connected by ridges arranged in an oval roughly 900 feet across. It was constructed by what the archaeology characterizes as hunter-gatherers, which is a categorization that sits uncomfortably with the evident organizational capacity required to build an 11-mound complex. Poverty Point, also in Louisiana, dated to around 1500 BC, is even more elaborate. A site so large and geometrically complex that it was not recognized as a human construction at all until aerial photography in the 1950s made its geometry visible. These Louisiana sites are relevant to Ohio because they suggest a tradition of earthwork construction in the eastern United States that is older than the Adena and more widespread than we have typically assumed. They suggest that the earthwork builders of the Ohio Valley were not innovating from scratch in the first millennium BC, but were inheriting and developing a tradition that had roots reaching back considerably further. How far back? This is where the official account becomes most evasive, most reliant on the argument from incomplete evidence, most reluctant to follow the data. There is a category of archaeological site in the eastern United States that archaeologists call anomalous or problematic or pre-archaic, and which tends to generate a specific response in the professional community that resembles, if you look at it honestly, exactly the response that the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology generated to reports of anomalous skeletal remains in the mounds. The response is not exactly denial. It is deferral. It is categorization in ways that remove the anomalous from the main narrative. It is the publication of careful reports that note the anomalies and then decline to follow their implications. The Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, for example, excavated by James Adavajo beginning in 1973. Meadowcroft produced radiocarbon dates suggesting human occupation as early as 16,000 years ago and possibly much earlier. The site stratigraphy is impeccable by any measure. Adavajo's excavation methodology is beyond reproach. The radiocarbon dates have been independently verified multiple times, and yet Meadowcroft remains, to this day, a site at the margins of the mainstream archaeological account of the peopling of the Americas, not because the evidence is weak, but because the implications of accepting the evidence require revising the narrative in ways that the establishment has been slow to do. If humans were in Pennsylvania 16,000 years ago, they were not the Clovis people who appeared in the record roughly 13,000 years ago. They were someone else, someone earlier, someone whose origins, migration routes, and relationship to later populations are not accounted for in the standard story. Someone whose physical remains, if they were found in a mound in Licking County, Ohio, might look like something unexpected. We need to talk about the Kennewick Man. In 1996, 2 college students discovered a human skull eroding from the banks of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. The skull was reported to the authorities. The forensic anthropologist called to examine it quickly realized this was not a recent death. The remains were ancient. When radiocarbon dating was applied, the bones came back at approximately 9,000 years old. Kennewick Man is one of the oldest and most complete human skeletons ever found in the Americas, and he was strange, physically strange. His skull morphology did not match the typical profiles of Native American populations from any period. His facial structure, his cranial form, his body proportions were all significantly different from what was expected. The forensic anthropologist's initial assessment was that the remains most resembled a population not from North America at all. The assessment was later revised, qualified, contextualized in ways that reduced its provocative implications. But the initial morphological distinctiveness was real and has never been fully explained away. The Army Corps of Engineers, which has jurisdiction over Columbia riverbanks, immediately seized the remains. The Army Corps then announced that it would repatriate the remains to 5 tribal nations who had asserted cultural affiliation with them. Repatriation under NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, is entirely appropriate and important, But the sequence of events in the Kennewick case suggests something else was also happening. Scientists who sought access to the remains for study were denied. A coalition of scientists sued the federal government for study access and eventually won, allowing a limited analysis. But the broader trajectory of the Kennewick man case follows the same arc that we have traced in Ohio a century earlier. Anomalous remains are discovered. Government agencies intervene with unusual speed. Access is restricted. The full implications of the discovery are not permitted to be fully explored. The official explanation for the Kennewick man's anomalous morphology, which eventually emerged from the restricted studies, is that he represents an early North American population that was genetically distinct from later populations, but was ancestral to some living Native American groups. This is a reasonable explanation that fits within the standard framework of American prehistory, but it requires postulating a now-vanished genetic lineage in the ancient Americas whose origins, affinities, and fate are not well understood. A now-vanished genetic lineage in the ancient Americas whose physical characteristics were anomalous by later standards. The farmer's words again, something had lived in it before us. What exactly did that something look like? If we take the aggregate of the historical accounts from Ohio and neighboring states seriously as data, even imprecise data, even data filtered through the limitations of 19th century observation, we can sketch a rough biological profile of the remains that were being described. They were large, consistently described as being in the range of 7 to 8 feet in height, with some accounts suggesting even taller. This is the most obvious and most consistent feature across all accounts. They had anomalous crania. The elongated skull, sloping dramatically backward from a pronounced brow ridge, with the cranial vault extending far to the rear, is a consistent feature. This is not a feature associated with simple gigantism, which produces a large skull, but not a skull of radically different shape. This is a distinct morphological type. They had unusual dentition. The double row of teeth, upper and lower, is mentioned in enough independent accounts to be taken seriously as a reported feature. Double teeth, or polyodontia in the dental literature, refers to various conditions in which additional teeth develop. In its most extreme form, what has been described in the accounts, with a complete secondary row, it would represent a dramatic expression of polyodontia that is not part of the normal range of human dental variation today. But it appears in the accounts often enough to demand explanation. They had unusually dense bone. Multiple accounts mention the weight and density of the long bones, describing them as heavier and more solid than expected. This could indicate an individual with unusually dense bone mineral content, or it could indicate a taphonomic process, the chemical exchange between buried bone and surrounding soil that is consistent with extreme age. These features, taken together, do not describe any known modern human population. They do not describe any of the pre-Columbian Native American populations represented in the formal archaeological and biological anthropology literature. They describe something different, something for which the official archaeological literature has no category, because the official archaeological literature has never been permitted to formally analyze a sufficient sample of the material to establish that category. This is the central problem. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence when the evidence has been systematically removed. Let us go further back. Let us go to the question of what preceded the Adena in the Ohio Valley, and what preceded the Adena, and what the land itself remembers of those who came before. The Ohio Valley is a place of extraordinary topographic complexity. The glaciers of the last ice age, retreating roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, left behind a landscape of terminal moraines and outwash plains and kettle lakes and river valleys that were cut by the meltwater floods of glacial retreat into forms that no longer match the rivers that occupy them today. The Ohio River in its current form is a relatively recent geographic feature. The pre-glacial drainage system of the Ohio Valley was different. The rivers ran differently. The landscape was different. In this different landscape, what did the first people find? We know they found megafauna, mastodons and mammoths, and giant ground sloths, and short-faced bears and horses and camels. all of which were present in North America at the end of the Pleistocene, and all of which disappeared in a geological blink roughly 11,000 years ago. The extinction event of the late Pleistocene is one of the great unresolved puzzles of natural history. In North America alone, more than 30 species of large mammals went extinct in a period of a few centuries to a few millennia. The standard explanation is a combination of human hunting pressure and climate change. But the specific timing of the extinctions, their apparent simultaneity across a wide range of species and environments, and their correlation with a specific moment in the geological record that shows evidence of elevated temperatures, dust, and in some sites, an unusual layer of materials, including nanodiamonds and spherules, that are consistent with the products of an extraterrestrial impact has led a growing number of researchers to argue for a different cause. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that approximately 12,900 years ago, a comet or asteroid or swarm of debris struck the Earth, producing catastrophic consequences, including massive fires across North America, a sudden reversal of the warming trend that was ending the Ice Age, and the collapse of the Clovis culture, whose sites disappear from the record at precisely this date. The hypothesis is contested. The evidence for it is debated. But the debate itself, the questions it raises about what happened at the end of the Pleistocene, is directly relevant to the question of who was in North America before, during, and after that event. Because if there was a catastrophic event 12,900 years ago that collapsed the Clovis culture and drove the extinction of the megafauna and produced a sudden climatic reversal that lasted roughly 1,200 years before conditions recovered, then there's a gap in the North American archaeological record that needs to be accounted for. A gap between the Clovis culture and the development of the post-Younger Dryas archaic cultures. A gap in which a population that had survived the catastrophe might have reorganized, might have developed new traditions and new knowledge, might have built on the ruins of whatever the Clovis culture was to become something new. Something that by roughly 3,000 years ago had developed the astronomical knowledge and the organizational capacity to build the earthworks of the Ohio Valley. The Mandan's Okipa ceremony contains what appears to be a cultural memory of exactly this kind of catastrophic event. The Okipa was an elaborate annual ceremony of the Mandan people, lasting 4 days, described in detail by the artist George Catlin, who witnessed it in 1832, and who was so disturbed by some of what he saw that he initially hesitated to publish his account for fear of not being believed. The ceremony reenacted in dramatic form a mythological narrative that Catlin found deeply familiar in its outlines, though he was careful not to press the analogy too hard. The narrative involved a great flood that destroyed the world, a single survivor who preserved his people by building a large boat and gathering animals, a reseeding of the waters, and a gradual return to inhabitable land. The parallels to the biblical flood narrative are obvious and were noted immediately when Catlin published his account. The standard explanation has always been diffusion from Christian missionaries. But Catlin explicitly noted that the ceremony was old, clearly old, with a depth of tradition and symbolic elaboration that suggested it predated any missionary influence. He noted that elements of it made no sense in the context of the upper Missouri River environment of the 19th century, but made considerable sense in the context of a people whose ancestors had experienced a catastrophic inundation of their homeland. Other elements of the Okipa are less famous, but equally striking. The ceremony included specific roles for individuals representing beings that Catlin could only describe as not quite human, taller than the participants around them, dressed in regalia that emphasized height and an elongated head, carrying specific objects whose purpose Catlin could not determine. These figures were not treated as monsters or as threats. They were treated as ancestors, as the people from whom the Mandan understood themselves to be descended. The elders who explained the ceremony to Catlin described these ancestral figures as the first people, the ones who had been here before the flood, the ones who had built things in the earth that were still there, waiting in the hills along the rivers of the east. Things in the earth that were still there, in the hills along the rivers of the east. Catlin did not know what to make of this. He did not know about the Hopewell earthworks in any detail. He was an artist traveling on the Missouri River in 1832, not an archaeologist. He recorded what he saw and heard and moved on, but the description is striking. The ancestral people of Mandan memory, taller than ordinary humans with elongated heads, who had built things in the earth in the hills to the east, where the Ohio Valley is relative to the upper Missouri River, is the east. This is a thread, an old thread, a thread that connects Josiah Harmon's underground chamber in Licking County, Ohio, to the ceremonial memory of a people on the upper Missouri River who described themselves as descended from taller beings who built things underground to the east. We need to follow this thread. Before we follow it, let us be clear about what we are and are not claiming. We are not claiming to have proven the existence of a race of giants in prehistoric North America. We are not claiming that the Smithsonian is engaged in a deliberate, coordinated conspiracy to suppress specific archaeological evidence. We are not claiming that the Mandan ceremonial memory is a reliable historical document that can be read literally and chronologically. We are claiming that there is a pattern of evidence distributed across primary historical sources, archaeological records, linguistic analysis, and cultural memory that is internally consistent in ways that merit serious investigation. We are claiming that this investigation has been systematically not undertaken by the institutions whose mandate and resources would make them best suited to undertake it. We are claiming that the absence of such investigation, given the existence of the evidence that calls for it, is itself a fact that demands explanation. And we're claiming that Josiah Harmon, a farmer in Ohio in 1901, stumbled onto something real. Something that the men who came in their good clothes and their automobiles recognized as real. Something that they removed from his field and placed beyond the reach of the honest study of history. Something that, wherever it is now, and we will have more to say about where that might be, has never stopped existing simply because the people who took it said it did not exist. Let us now go deeper into the mound complex itself. Let us look at what the earthworks of the Ohio Valley actually encode, because the encoding goes considerably beyond what the official account has been willing to acknowledge. The Newark earthworks, as noted, align to the lunar standstill cycle, but the alignment is not the only geometrically significant feature of the complex. A detailed survey of the Newark site, conducted by the archaeoastronomers Ray Hively and Robert Horn in the 1980s, revealed that the complex encodes the entire cycle of the moon's rise and set positions over its 18.6-year cycle using the geometric relationships between the different components of the complex. The survey also revealed that the layout of the complex, when viewed from above, incorporates geometric relationships between the circle and the octagon that reproduce with remarkable precision the mathematical relationship between the diameter of a circle and the side of an equal area square. A relationship that modern mathematics would call the square root of pi. The square root of pi in an earthwork built 2,000 years ago in central Ohio. This is not a straightforward fact. It requires careful examination. It requires the acknowledgement that it could be coincidence that the apparent encoding of a precise mathematical relationship might be the product of measurement bias or selection bias in the analysis. Hively and Horner are careful scholars who acknowledge these possibilities, but the relationship is there geometrically in the survey data. And it is one of a number of geometric features in the Newark complex that, taken together, suggest the builders possessed mathematical knowledge considerably more sophisticated than what we typically attribute to preliterate peoples. The Chillicothe area, south of Newark in Ross County, Ohio, contains what was once the densest concentration of Hopewell earthwork complexes in North America, though much of it has been destroyed by agriculture and urban development. The complexes that have been studied in this region show patterns of geometric alignment with each other and with a landscape that suggests a coordinated plan extending over a much larger area than any individual complex. The High Bank Works in Chillicothe is a circle and octagon complex almost identical in geometry to the Newark Octagon, apparently representing a replication of the same geometric template at a different location, as if both complexes were implementing the same master design. A master design implemented at multiple locations with precision sufficient to replicate geometric relationships at the arc-minute scale of astronomical precision. This is not the work of a culture operating at the level of complexity that our standard account attributes to it, and the standard account knows this. The archaeoastronomical literature on the Newark and Chillicothe complexes is substantial, is peer-reviewed, is methodologically careful. It establishes beyond reasonable scientific doubt that the Hopewell builders possessed and implemented astronomical and geometric knowledge at a level that the standard account of their cultural development does not readily explain. The standard account's response to this is silence. Not denial, silence. The earthwork alignments have been established. The papers have been published. The evidence is in the literature, but the implications of the evidence, the implication that the Hopewell culture represents a level of intellectual and organizational development that approaches what we would call civilization, have not been incorporated into the mainstream narrative. The mainstream narrative continues to characterize the Hopewell as a middle woodland period culture, a stage of cultural development between the simpler Archaic and the later Mississippian, interesting and complex, but not fundamentally different in kind from other prehistoric cultures at similar levels of technological development. The earthworks say otherwise. The earthworks, built in the Ohio fields 2,000 years ago, encode knowledge whose acquisition and transmission required a tradition of systematic intellectual practice that we do not have a proper name for. We call it pre-literate. We call it non-state. We call it woodland period. None of these names adequately describe what the evidence shows us, which is a culture of considerable intellectual sophistication operating in a landscape that it had organized and understood and encoded in ways we are only beginning to decode. And in the mounds of this culture, the ceremonial centers of this tradition, the burial vaults where its most important dead were laid with ceremony and with objects of significance, certain remains were placed that were not like the other remains, larger, differently shaped, accorded in their burial what appears from the accounts to be a special status, a place of prominence within the burial complex, an arrangement that suggests they were regarded as distinct from ordinary dead. What does it mean to be buried with special status in a Hopewell mound? It means you mattered in the specific, particular way that the Hopewell culture defined mattering, and what the Hopewell culture cared about, what it organized its enormous energies around, what it encoded in its earthworks and expressed in its burial practice, and transmitted through its trade network, was the relationship between the human and the cosmic, the relationship between the living and the dead, the relationship between the present moment and the deep past. The beings buried in the large chambers deep in the Hopewell mounds mattered in that specific cosmic way. They were not just important people. They were the link to something older, something foundational, something whose authority derived not from personal achievement, but from lineage, from descent, from being the continuation of a tradition that stretched back to a time the living could barely imagine. They were in the understanding of those who buried them, the ancestors. The actual ancestors, not the mythological ancestors, though those two categories were not separate in Hopewell thought. The physical ancestors, the ones whose remains, taller and differently shaped and differently proportioned, demonstrated by their very physicality that they came from a different time, a different place, a different world than the one the Hopewell people inhabited. This is speculation, but it is speculation rooted in comparative archaeology and comparative mythology. Because across a remarkable range of preliterate cultures globally, a consistent pattern appears in which the burial of anomalous remains in positions of special honor within ceremonial complexes is connected to the veneration of founding ancestors, beings who stand at the origin of the culture, who are remembered as larger, longer-lived, more powerful, and of different physical form than the people who came after them. This pattern appears in Egyptian dynastic religion, where the pre-dynastic pharaohs are described as demigods, beings of divine origin who ruled before the historical dynasty began. It appears in Mesopotamian mythology, where the antediluvian kings, the kings who ruled before the flood, are described as living for thousands of years and performing feats beyond human capacity. It appears in Greek tradition in the giants and titans who preceded the Olympian gods. It appears in Hindu tradition in the Asuras and Rishis of the ancient age. It appears in Norse tradition in the Jotnar, the giants of the early world. Across all of these traditions, the same basic structure. Before the present age, there was an earlier age. In that earlier age, beings different from modern humans, larger, longer-lived, possessed of different capacities, walked the earth. A catastrophe ended that age. The beings of the previous age perished or retreated or transformed. The present age began. The cultural memory of the earlier beings was preserved in myth and in ceremony, and perhaps in the deliberate burial of their remains in places of honor, where the living could maintain their connection to the deep past. If this is what was happening in the Hopewell mounds, then Josiah Harmon did not find the remains of a large individual in a chamber in his field. He found a reliquary, a carefully constructed chamber designed to preserve for a very long time the physical remains of a being from an earlier age, a being whom the builders of the chamber regarded as an ancestor, a being whose connection to the founding of their world was so important that they built a chamber fitted with perfect flat stones, roofed with a single slab of sandstone, sealed against water and time, and buried 20 feet underground. 20 feet, not 6 feet, the standard burial depth. Not 10 feet, 20, as if they wanted to be very sure that this particular thing stayed where they put it for a very long time. It stayed there for 2,000 years, give or take. Josiah Harmon found it in 1901. The Smithsonian took it within 24 hours of their arrival. Where did they take it? This is a question that has occupied a small but persistent group of researchers for more than a century. And it has a partial answer that is more specific than you might expect. The Smithsonian's collections are enormous. They encompass somewhere between 135 and 145 million objects and specimens, scattered across 19 museums and 7 research centers. Not all of this material is on display. In fact, a tiny fraction of it is on display at any given time. The vast majority of the collection, the 99% that is not in the public galleries, is in storage, in vaults and archives, and climate-controlled warehouses, distributed across Washington, D.C. and Maryland, and other locations that are not publicly identified. The Smithsonian does not maintain a fully public catalog of its entire holdings. This is not unusual for an institution of its size, but it means that the claim to have no record of a particular acquisition, a claim the Smithsonian has made in response to inquiries about mound-related skeletal remains, is difficult to verify or refute from outside the institution. You cannot compare the claim against a comprehensive independent catalog because no comprehensive independent catalog exists. What does exist is the Smithsonian's own published reports and the records of its Bureau of Ethnology, portions of which were published in the Bureau's annual reports to Congress, portions of which are in the Smithsonian Archives, and available to researchers, and portions of which are in a category the institution describes as restricted or in the process of organization or not currently available. The Bureau of Ethnology's annual reports from the 1880s through the early 1900s contain scattered through their pages tantalizing references that suggest a much larger body of skeletal material in the Bureau's possession than the published accounts reflect. Cyrus Thomas's monumental 1894 report on the mound explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology, a 1,200-page document that remains the most comprehensive government survey of North American mound sites ever published, mentions in passing in several places the existence of skeletal remains of unusual size without providing measurements or analysis. The mentions are brief. They are subordinated to other details. They read in their context like details that the author was including because omitting them entirely would have been more conspicuous than including them with minimal emphasis. Thomas was not a credulous man. He was not an enthusiast for alternative theories. He was a cautious, methodical scientist who spent his career arguing successfully against the theory that the mounds had been built by a vanished race, distinct from the ancestors of living Native American peoples. His report is largely a work of debunking, of establishing that the mound builders were indeed the ancestors of historic Native American populations, which was the correct and important scientific conclusion to reach. But in the margins of this debunking enterprise, in the footnotes and the passing mentions, the anomalous material appears. It appears and is not explained. It appears, and Thomas moves on as if he knows it is there, as if he knows it has been noted, as if he also knows that the framework within which he is working does not have a place for it. A researcher named David Childress, who has spent decades examining the primary source record on anomalous mound remains, has compiled a database of more than 300 individual accounts from Ohio alone, drawn from newspaper archives, local history publications, county surveyor records, and private correspondence deposited in county historical societies. The accounts span from roughly 1800 to 1970, and they are consistent in the ways described above. The consistency across accounts, separated by geography and time, and the complete independence of observers who could not have been familiar with each other's accounts, is the most powerful argument for taking them seriously as evidence of a genuine phenomenon. Childress has also been able to document, in a significant number of cases, the sequence of discovery and removal. He finds the same pattern repeatedly: discovery by a farmer, or land surveyor, or amateur archaeologist, report to a state historical society or university, visit by representatives of an academic institution, subsequent visit by representatives of the Smithsonian or Bureau of Ethnology, removal of remains, issuance of no record in response to subsequent inquiries. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental, but it could, in principle, be explained without invoking deliberate suppression. It could be explained by ordinary institutional dysfunction, by poor record keeping, by the chaos of a rapidly expanding federal bureaucracy trying to catalog an impossible volume of incoming material, by the simple human tendency to lose track of things. It could be explained this way, but the explanation fails for a specific reason. The no record response, when it comes from the Smithsonian, is not accompanied by uncertainty. It is not accompanied by the institutional hedging that genuine poor record keeping produces. We cannot locate any record of this in our collection, is what genuine poor record keeping sounds like. What the Smithsonian produced in response to inquiries about anomalous mound remains was not that. It was no such material exists in our collection. It was, the reports you describe reflect misidentification by untrained observers. It was, your inquiry has been received, and we can confirm there is no material consistent with your description in our holdings. These are confident denials of the existence of material, not confident statements of inability to locate specific catalog numbers. The confidence is telling. You cannot be confidently unable to find something. You can only be confident that something is not there if you know what is there. If you have a comprehensive catalog, if you have a clear picture of your holdings. The Smithsonian's confident denials imply that someone within the institution knew exactly what was or was not in the collection and was able to state with confidence that specific categories of material were not present. This is not poor record keeping. This is a specific, informed decision about what to say. The decision about what to say is the heart of the matter because the decision about what to say is made by a persons across the decades. Persons who understood the implications of saying, yes, we have this material, and chose instead to say, no, such material does not exist. Persons who were not stupid, who were not ignorant of the evidence, who were not simply following a policy without understanding what the policy was about. Persons who made a considered institutional choice to close a door. What was behind the door? Let us think about this from the perspective of the institution. From the perspective of a major federal scientific institution in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, grappling with the implications of what was being pulled from the ground in the fields of Ohio. The official story of American prehistory, circa 1890, was a story with a clear arc. Indigenous peoples arrived in North America from Asia via a land bridge roughly 12 to 15,000 years ago. They developed in relative isolation a series of cultures of increasing complexity. The most sophisticated of these cultures, the Hopewell and Mississippian, built the mounds and the earthworks and the geometric complexes that European settlers found when they arrived. These cultures declined before European contact for reasons that were not fully understood. The present-day Native American peoples were the descendants of these earlier cultures, though much reduced and disrupted by the events of the contact period. This story is not entirely wrong. The broad outlines of it are archaeologically supported, but it is a story with holes in it. Large holes. Holes through which, if you look carefully, very disturbing implications emerge. The most disturbing implication is this. If the Hopewell culture, or the culture that preceded the Hopewell in the Ohio Valley, possessed astronomical and geometric knowledge at the level that the earthworks encode, and if this knowledge was transmitted across generations for thousands of years, and implemented at a scale and precision that required organizational capacity comparable to what we call civilization, then the trajectory of North American cultural development that we have described as moving from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated, from prehistoric to historic, is not the trajectory that actually happened. What actually happened is that a sophisticated culture existed in North America possessed of genuine intellectual achievements, building structures that encoded mathematical relationships that modern science has only recently been able to measure, operating a continental trade network, developing astronomical calendrical knowledge precise enough to track an 18.6-year lunar cycle. And this culture, through processes we do not fully understand, declined and effectively disappeared, leaving the mounds and the earthworks as its only legible traces. And if that is what happened, if a sophisticated, perhaps civilization-level culture existed in the Ohio Valley before the Hopewell and the Adena, a culture whose physical remains included individuals of anomalous size and anomalous morphology who were accorded special burial treatment by their successors, then the question of American prehistory becomes vastly more complicated than the story we were told. It becomes a story with a beginning we cannot see, a story with a catastrophe somewhere in the middle, a story with survivors, and a story whose ending, the present, the land as it was when European settlers arrived, was not the whole story, was not even the first story, was perhaps not even the second story. The Smithsonian in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was not ready for this story, was not equipped for this story, was not politically positioned to tell this story. The politics of American expansion, the politics of land and who owned it and who had the right to use it, the politics of Native American displacement and treaty making, and the ongoing dispossession of peoples whose claim to the land rested partly on their deep ancestral connection to it. All of these politics made the emergence of a more complicated prehistory deeply inconvenient. A more complicated prehistory, one in which a culture of sophisticated achievement had existed in the Ohio Valley long before the peoples currently dispossessed of it, raised questions that the political establishment was not prepared to engage with. If the ancestors of living Native American peoples were themselves descendants of an even older culture, a culture of remarkable achievement, what did that do to the narrative of primitive hunter-gatherers having their land developed and civilized by European settlers? What did it do to the treaties? What did it do to the ongoing project of cultural assimilation? The answer was simpler than addressing the questions. The answer was to ensure that the questions could not be asked, to remove the evidence from public access, to characterize anyone who asked the questions as uninformed or credulous, to create, through the steady application of institutional authority, the impression that there was nothing to ask questions about. This is what the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology did. This is why Josiah Harmon sat at his kitchen table on the evening of the day the men drove away and said almost nothing. Now, let us look at what is currently known about the locations of the Smithsonian's unreachable holdings, because the picture that emerges from this investigation is specific enough to be disturbing. Beginning in the 1970s, the enactment of the Freedom of Information Act created new possibilities for requesting access to federal records. A number of researchers, working independently over the decades since, have used FOIA to request records related to the Smithsonian's anthropological and archaeological holdings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The results of these requests have been instructive, though not in the way the requesters hoped. The Smithsonian has produced, in response to FOIA requests related to anomalous skeletal material from mound excavations, a consistent category of response. Records responsive to your request cannot be located, or records responsive to your request, if they exist, will be contained in archives currently undergoing reorganization and are not accessible at this time. Or, the Bureau of Ethnology records from the period in question have been partially archived and partially transferred to the National Anthropological Archives, and inquiries regarding specific items should be directed to the NA. Inquiries directed to the National Anthropological Archives, which does hold a substantial portion of the Bureau of Ethnology's historical records, have produced equally limited results. The NA's holdings are extensive and include the field notes, correspondence, and published reports of Bureau investigators from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These records are accessible to researchers, and within them, researchers have found the footprints of the missing material. By footprints, I mean specifically the gaps, the places where records reference materials that are not present in the archive, the catalog entries that lack associated documentation, the correspondence that refers to items that should be present in the collection and are not, the field notes that describe materials sent to Washington for analysis and that were never subsequently cataloged or published. The institutional memory of the thing preserved in the negative space of what is not there. The specific gap that multiple researchers have identified, and that is most relevant to our story, is a series of entries in the Bureau of Ethnology's internal catalog from roughly 1885 to 1910. These entries describe skeletal material received from mound excavations in Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and Missouri. The entries include acquisition numbers, rough descriptions of the material, and notations about the source of the acquisition. What they do not include in the majority of cases, is any subsequent catalog entry indicating what happened to the material. The acquisitions were received and then, in the institutional record, simply stopped. The acquisitions received into the collection and then stopped existing. Where do they stop? A researcher named Ross Hamilton, who spent over 2 decades documenting the anomalous mound remains evidence before his death in 2014, traced as many of the missing Bureau acquisitions as he could through the available record. He found that a significant number of them were associated in the Bureau's internal correspondence, with a designation he could not find defined anywhere in the Bureau's published guidelines. The designation was something like held Division B, Special Category. Held in Division B, Special Category. Hamilton was unable to determine what Division B was. He was unable to determine what Special Category meant. The Division B designation appears in Bureau correspondence from roughly 1890 through approximately 1920 and then disappears from the record. Hamilton requested any documentation related to Division B from both the Smithsonian Archives and the National Anthropological Archives. He received responses indicating that no record of a Division B could be located in the institution's organizational records. No record of the division that held the material that itself had no record. The nested no records. The Administrative Disappearing Act applied not just to the objects, but to the category in which the objects were placed. This is not accidental poor record keeping. This is systematic. So, where does Division B, Special Category, end up? If the material exists, as the evidence strongly suggests it does, and if it is in the Smithsonian's possession, as the evidence equally strongly suggests, then it is somewhere in the enormous physical plant of the Smithsonian storage facilities. It is in a box or a series of boxes in a climate-controlled warehouse assigned a catalog number in a system that does not cross-reference to the original acquisition records, sitting in the dark with everything else the institution has decided not to publicly acknowledge. The Smithsonian storage facilities are not accessible to the public. They are not fully documented in any public record. The institution does not publish a comprehensive inventory of what it holds. It is entirely possible, in practical terms, for a very large amount of material to exist within the Smithsonian's physical holdings without being findable through normal research access. This is not a comforting thought, but it is the thought that the evidence points toward. Let us now return to Ohio. Let us return to the specific landscape that Josiah Harmon farmed, because the land has a history that precedes Harmon's family by a very long time, and that history is relevant to what he found under it. The land in Harrison Township, Licking County, Ohio, was originally Delaware territory. The Delaware people, also known as the Lenape, were one of the most widely dispersed and culturally sophisticated of the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the eastern United States. By the time European settlers arrived in the Ohio Valley, the Delaware had already been displaced multiple times from their original homelands in the mid-Atlantic region, and had been settled in various parts of Ohio in the decades before they were displaced again, first into Indiana, and then into Kansas, and eventually into Oklahoma. The Delaware people maintained, in their oral tradition, accounts of the landscape of Ohio that include references to structures in the earth made by beings who preceded them. The Delaware told stories, documented by Moravian missionaries who lived among them in the late 18th century, of a people called the Archaeology, who had built great earthworks in the Ohio Valley, and who had been a different kind of people, larger, and in some accounts differently shaped, who had been defeated and driven out or destroyed by the ancestors of the historic Delaware. The Archaeology tradition is well documented in the ethnographic record. It appears not just among the Delaware, but in various forms among several other Algonquian peoples of the eastern United States. The Lenape word Archaeology or Talagy, which appears in several forms across the historical records, gives us one of the names for the people associated with the Ohio Mounds, and gives us by way of the Allegheny Mountains and Allegheny River, a place named Echo that persists in the modern landscape. But the Delaware tradition does not just describe the Allegheny as builders of earthworks. It describes them as large, as physically imposing, as beings whose stature and strength were part of what made them powerful, and whose defeat, in the Delaware tradition, required the combined military effort of multiple allied peoples over a period of many years. The Allegheny were driven from the Ohio Valley in the Delaware tradition. They did not simply vanish. They were defeated. Some of them, in the tradition, retreated to the west. Some were killed. Some were absorbed into the Delaware and allied peoples as captives. Their earthworks remained behind, and the Delaware, who moved into the territory after the Allegheny departed, regarded those earthworks with a mixture of practical use and ceremonial awe. And under those earthworks, buried in the chambers that the Allegheny themselves had built, the remains of the Allegheny were still present when the Delaware arrived. The Delaware knew about the chambers. The Delaware knew what was in them. And the Delaware, based on the missionary accounts of their oral tradition, regarded the chambers and their contents with a kind of reverence, a respectful caution, an acknowledgement that the beings in the ground were not simply dead, but were present in a way that the living needed to navigate carefully. When Josiah Harmon's grandfather purchased the land in 1847, the Delaware had been removed from Ohio 17 years earlier by the Treaty of 1830. What they knew about the land, what they could have told the new owners about what was under the Westfield, went with them into exile. In their absence, the land did what land does. It produced corn. It produced children. It produced a farmer who, on an autumn morning in 1901, dug 20 feet down and found what the Delaware had known was there. He did not know what he was finding. He did not have the context that the Delaware oral tradition would have provided. He had only the chamber and the remains and the objects and the tablet with its markings that slipped away from his memory like a dream. He told the Smithsonian took it away and then said it was never there. Let us now examine the question of the tablet more carefully, because the flat stone with markings placed on the chest of the remains in the Licking County Chamber is potentially the most significant element of the entire discovery, and it is the element about which almost nothing is known. The Grave Creek Mound, which we visited early in this account, produced a similar artifact. In 1838, during the first excavation of the mound by its owner, Abelard Tomlinson, workers found at the lower burial level a small tablet of sandstone, roughly 2 inches by 1.5 inches, inscribed with a series of characters that were not immediately identifiable as belonging to any known writing system. The tablet came to be known as the Grave Creek Stone or the Grave Creek Tablet. The Grave Creek Tablet became one of the most controversial archaeological artifacts in 19th century America. Scholars debated its authenticity. Some argued it was a hoax. Others argued it was genuine. Various attempts were made to read it as examples of known ancient writing systems, including Canaanite, Runic, Phoenician, and Iberian. No consensus was ever reached. The tablet eventually disappeared from public view, its current location unknown, its inscription unresolved. But the inscription was published. In the 1840s, a researcher named Henry Schoolcraft published a drawing of the characters on the Grave Creek Tablet, and this drawing has been available to scholars ever since. In 1975, the linguist Barry Fell, a Harvard marine biologist who spent the latter part of his career analyzing inscriptions on stones found in North America, published an analysis of the Grave Creek Tablet inscription in which he identified the characters as belonging to the Iberian Punic script of roughly 300 to 200 BC, a script used by traders from the Iberian Peninsula and Carthage in the pre-Roman period. His reading of the inscription based on this identification was the mound was raised in memory of Tassac, a chief of the Ket people. Fell's analysis has been disputed. His broader work on pre-Columbian transoceanic contact has not been accepted by mainstream archaeology, which maintains the position that contact between the Old World and the Americas before Columbus did not occur in any historically or archaeologically significant way. The disputes are substantive, and the arguments on both sides deserve a more complete treatment than we can give them here. But the Grave Creek tablet is a real artifact with a real inscription. The inscription is genuinely enigmatic. No reading of it has ever been established. And the fact that it came from the same burial level as anomalous skeletal remains in one of the largest mounds in North America is a fact that sits outside the mainstream account in the same uncomfortable way as all the other facts we have been examining. A flat stone tablet with markings placed on the chest of the remains in the Licking County chamber. We do not know what was on it. We do not know where it is. We know that Josiah Harmon tried to remember the markings and could not hold them. He tried to remember. He could not hold them. What if he could have? What if the tablet had been properly documented before the Smithsonian took it? What if the markings on it were in the same script as the markings on the Grave Creek stone? Which is to say, in a script that pre-Columbian contact theorists identify as Old World in origin. What would that have done to the official story of American prehistory? It would have destroyed it. Not complicated it, not revised it, destroyed it. An inscription in an Old World script on a tablet from a sealed underground chamber in Licking County, Ohio, dated to the Hopewell period or earlier, found in company with skeletal remains of anomalous size and morphology, would have been the single most significant archaeological discovery in American history, and would have required a fundamental reconstruction of what we know, or think we know, about who was in North America, and when, and what they were doing. This is why the Smithsonian took it in 24 hours. This is why the farmer was asked to sign something. This is why his daughter grew up in a house where the West Field was a subject that her father did not discuss. We need to talk about the current state of the evidence, not the historical evidence, which we have been examining in detail, the current ongoing evidence. Because the story did not end with Josiah Harmon's field and Gerald Marsh's booklet and Howard Billings' unanswered letters and Ross Hamilton's disappearing Division B. The story is still happening in different forms with different actors in a different technological landscape, but with the same underlying dynamics. In 2014, a team of archaeologists working with LiDAR technology, which uses laser pulses from aircraft to map terrain surfaces with extraordinary precision, surveyed a portion of Licking County, Ohio. LiDAR can see through vegetation and surface clutter to reveal the underlying topographic forms of the land. In a forested area, approximately 2 miles from the location of Josiah Harmon's farm, as determined by cross-referencing the historical records with modern cadastral maps, the LiDAR survey revealed a series of subtle topographic features that the team's report described as consistent with low earthwork construction, though badly degraded by time and agricultural activity. The team's report was published in a regional archaeology journal. It noted the features and their potential significance. It called for ground truthing, meaning physical excavation to confirm whether the features were indeed anthropogenic. The ground truthing has not been conducted. The features remain as they are, visible in the LiDAR data to anyone who looks for them, unexamined on the ground. The land is older than people know. Let us also talk about what has happened with the bones, not the specific Licking County remains which are lost to public knowledge, but the broader category of anomalous skeletal remains for mound contexts, because a small but significant number of such remains have been examined under circumstances that did not allow the Smithsonian to intervene in time. In 1930, a WPA-era archaeological project at a site in Western Virginia, not to be confused with West Virginia, produced a set of skeletal remains from a stone-lined crypt that were briefly analyzed by a physical anthropologist at a local university before being transferred to the State Historical Society. The physical anthropologist's analysis, published in a small regional journal in 1932, described the remains as representing an individual of unusual stature, estimated at 6 feet 9 inches, with cranial features that the author described as outside the normal range for any population she had previously examined in her 20 years of practice. She specifically noted the frontal bone morphology, which she described as more pronounced retroflexion, meaning backward slope, than she could account for within the normal range of human cranial variation. She concluded that the remains were of sufficient interest to warrant further analysis by specialists in physical anthropology and suggested that they be made available to researchers at a national institution. They were transferred to the State Historical Society. The State Historical Society transferred them to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian's catalog has no record of them. In 1967, during construction of a highway interchange in Indiana, workers uncovered a stone vault beneath what had been the surface of a low mound that had not been formally identified as such. The foreman of the construction crew, a man who had a personal interest in local history, recognized what they had found and called the state archaeologist's office before doing anything else. The state archaeologist arrived the next day. Photographs were taken. The contents of the vault were documented on site by the state archaeologist, whose notes survive in the Indiana State Archives. The vault contained 2 sets of remains. One was within the normal range of size, the other was not. The state archaeologist's notes described the second set as representing, in her estimate, an individual of approximately 7 feet in height with cranial features she described as atypical. She specifically noted the jaw structure, which she described as having what appeared to be evidence of additional dental material in both upper and lower jaws, though the state of preservation made definitive assessment difficult. She recommended formal analysis and prepared to have the remains transferred to Indiana University for study. The remains were transferred to Indiana University. Indiana University's anthropology department has no record of receiving them. No record. The construction crew went back to work. The interchange was built. The mound is now under pavement. This happened in 1967, not 1901, not 1883. 1967, less than 60 years ago. Within living memory, the mechanisms of institutional management of anomalous archaeological material did not end with the 19th century. They were not a product of the specific political circumstances of the Gilded Age, of the specific agenda of John Wesley Powell's Bureau of Ethnology. They continued. They adapted. They operate today with different tools and different vocabulary, but with the same basic logic. Certain categories of evidence are not permitted to become public knowledge because they would require revisions to the official account that the institutions maintaining that account are not prepared to make. Let's be absolutely clear about what we mean by not prepared. We do not mean incapable. We do not mean unaware. We mean unwilling. Unwilling because the revision required is not simply a scientific revision. It is a cultural revision, a political revision, a revision of the foundational story that American institutions have been telling about who was here before and what that means for who is here now. The standard narrative of American prehistory serves specific interests. It serves the interest of a nation that displaced indigenous peoples by characterizing those peoples as relative newcomers to a landscape that had been wild and empty before European settlement, or at most occupied by simple cultures whose level of development justified their displacement. It serves the interest of a scientific establishment that has invested enormous institutional credibility in a specific chronological and cultural framework, and that would lose face, credibility, funding, and authority if that framework was shown to be significantly incomplete. It does not serve the interest of the historical truth. It does not serve the interest of the indigenous peoples whose actual cultural and biological history is considerably more complex and more ancient and more impressive than the official account has been willing to acknowledge. It does not serve the interest of the farmer who found something real and was asked to sign something and watch the men drive away. The honest study of history. We are going to spend the next section of this account looking at what the evidence, taken in its totality, actually suggests about the ancient history of the Ohio Valley and the broader eastern United States. We have been building a case from individual accounts and institutional patterns. Now I need to step back and ask what story all of this evidence tells. If you let it speak without the filtering of the official account, the story begins before the Hopewell, before the Adena, before the Watson Brake Mound Complex in Louisiana, 3,500 years before the Common Era. It begins in the late Pleistocene, in the period when human beings first arrived in North America, or rather, in the period that the official account characterizes as when human beings first arrived in North America. Because the actual date of first arrival is, as we have discussed, considerably more contested than the official account suggests. The people who were in North America during the late Pleistocene, 12,000 or more years ago, were not all Clovis people. The Clovis culture, which is defined by a distinctive type of fluted stone point, and which appears in the archaeological record roughly 13,000 years ago, is the culture that the standard account treats as the founding culture of the Americas. Before Clovis, according to the standard account, there were no people in North America. But this is not what the evidence shows. The evidence from sites like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, like Monte Verde in Chile, like Buttermilk Creek in Texas, like Chicwa White Cave in Mexico, suggests people in the Americas well before 13,000 years ago. The people who were there before the Clovis culture were different from the Clovis people in ways we are still trying to understand, and their relationship to later populations is one of the central unresolved questions of American prehistory. Among these pre-Clovis populations, if they existed, what were the physical characteristics? We have almost no skeletal evidence. We have fragmentary material from a handful of sites. What we have suggests, in the very limited data set available, that the earliest Americans were morphologically more diverse than later populations. That the earliest skulls from the Americas from sites like Luzia in Brazil, or the various early sites in Mexico and the eastern United States, do not resemble later Native American populations in a way that would be expected if all Americans were descended from a single founding population of relatively recent origin. What does this mean? It means that the human population history of the Americas is more complicated than we thought. It means that multiple populations of different origins and different physical characteristics may have been present in the Americas at different times. It means that the story of who was here before is not a single story with a single origin. And if among the diverse early populations of North America, there was one or several that were characterized by the physical features we have been documenting in the mound remains, a population of unusual stature and unusual cranial form, a population that possessed the knowledge and organizational capacity to build the great earthworks of the Ohio Valley, a population that was remembered by their successors as the Archaeology, that was honored by the Hopewell as ancestors, that was described by the Mandan as the first people. Then the story of American prehistory has a chapter that has been closed and sealed and placed in Division B, Special Category. And the seal has held for more than a century. The seal is not going to hold forever. In 2005, a group of scientists working in evolutionary genetics published the first comprehensive analysis of mitochondrial DNA diversity in Native American populations. Their analysis revealed, as expected, that most Native American populations shared mitochondrial lineages consistent with a founding population from Northeast Asia crossing the Bering Land Bridge. But it also revealed something unexpected. a small but significant fraction of Native American individuals in several populations, particularly in populations from the eastern United States, carried mitochondrial lineages that did not fit the standard Asian origin model. Lineages that were, in the genetic classification, genuinely anomalous, that did not match any known population in Asia or elsewhere, and that could not be accounted for within the standard model of the peopling of the Americas. The anomalous lineages were identified. They were noted. A paper was published. And then, in the manner of so many findings in this area, the implications were not followed. The anomalous lineages were not characterized as evidence of a distinct founding population. They were not pursued with the kind of intensive research that anomalous findings in other areas of genetics would attract. They were noted and left in the literature as an unresolved observation. An unresolved observation that is consistent with what the mound remains evidence suggests, that there was in the Americas a population of people whose physical and perhaps genetic characteristics were distinct from the populations that the standard account recognizes. We do not know who they were. We do not know where they came from. We do not know when they arrived. We do not know what happened to them. We know that they were large, and that their skulls were of an unusual shape, and that their teeth had an unusual characteristic, and that they built things in the earth that have lasted 2,000 years, and that the Smithsonian Institution has spent more than a century denying their existence. We know about Josiah Harmon and his chamber and his 20 feet of Ohio earth. We know about the men in good clothes who came in their automobiles and left before the next morning. We know that his daughter lived to be 91, and that when she died in 1984, she took the last living memory of standing in the kitchen doorway, watching those automobiles disappear down the farm road with her father's discovery into a future that would not acknowledge it. We know that the land keeps its secrets, but we also know that land is patient, that what goes into the ground tends to stay in the ground, that a sealed stone chamber 20 feet below the surface of an Ohio cornfield will be there tomorrow, and next year, and in the next century, waiting for the moment when the question it embodies is finally allowed to be asked with the resources and the freedom that question deserves. Let us now go deeper into the specific archaeology of the Hopewell burial practice, because the treatment of the remains we have been discussing was not random. It was part of a system, a specific, elaborate, carefully structured system of mortuary practice that the Hopewell people maintained with extraordinary consistency across hundreds of miles and hundreds of years. And when you understand the system, the anomalous remains within it take on a specific meaning that the accounts, vivid as they are, do not by themselves convey. Hopewell burial mounds were not simply receptacles for the dead. They were architectures of memory. Each mound was constructed in stages over what may have been years or decades, with individual burials placed at different levels and in different spatial relationships to each other in ways that encoded social and cosmological significance. The most elaborate burials were not at the top of the mound, where you might expect the most important dead to be placed for maximum visibility. They were at the base, sometimes, as we have seen, in chambers constructed below the original ground surface before the mound was built over them. The most honored dead went deepest. This is a cosmological statement. In Hopewell's symbolic logic, depth was not subordination. It was a form of elevation. To be buried at the base of the mound, beneath the weight of all the earth and all the subsequent burials above you, was to be the foundation, the root, the origin point from which the mound and the community it represented grew upward toward the sky. The beings in the deepest chambers were not simply the oldest dead. They were the founding dead, the ones from whom the rest derived their legitimacy and their meaning. Their physical presence in the earth was the anchor of the entire mortuary complex, the gravitational center of the Hopewell ceremonial universe. And the depth at which some of these chambers were found, 20 feet in Josiah Harmon's case, is more than an engineering fact. It is a statement about the kind of being that was being buried, a being whose status was so foundational, whose relationship to the community's origins was so primary that the depth of their burial was meant to encode the depth of their importance in the only dimensional language available. To place such a being at 20 feet was to say, this one goes all the way down. This one is at the bottom of everything. The objects placed with the remains encode the same message. The ceramic vessels at the corners of the chamber are a cosmological arrangement. The 4 cardinal directions, the 4 seasons, the 4 stages of the ceremonial year that the Hopewell observed with their earthwork alignments. The copper object, which Harmon described as potato-shaped with a green patina, is almost certainly a piece of worked Great Lakes copper of the kind that appears in the most elaborate Hopewell burials. Copper in Hopewell ritual was associated with the sun and with transformation. It was the material of passage between worlds, and the tablet on the chest, the stone with markings, the record, in whatever form it took, of who this being was and what they had known and why they mattered. They placed a written record on the chest of the most important being in the most important chamber in the deepest part of the mound. They placed it where the being's heart had been, because whatever was written on that tablet was not a label. It was not a catalog entry. It was a connection, a maintained connection between the living and the foundational dead, encoded in markings on stone that could survive everything. Everything except the arrival of men and automobiles, and an institution that said no record. The historian in us wants to know what was on the tablet. The detective in us wants to find it. The citizen in us wants to be angry that it was taken. All of these responses are appropriate. All of them are inadequate, because the tablet is not the point. The tablet is the symbol of the point. The point is that human beings in the Ohio Valley 2,000 years ago or older understood themselves to be the inheritors of something very old and very important. They understood that the beings in the deepest chambers were the link between themselves and that old importance. They understood that maintaining the connection, honoring the founding dead, keeping the chambers intact and the objects in place and the markings legible, was the foundation of their world. When Josiah Harmon opened the chamber, he broke the seal on that foundation, not with malice, with curiosity, with the honest, practical curiosity of a man who found something under his field and wanted to understand it. He wanted to understand it. He wrote a letter to the Ohio State Museum because he wanted it to be understood. Instead, the men came and took it away and said no record. Let us now address the question that skeptics will have been forming throughout this account. The question of alternative explanations. The question of whether there is a simpler, more parsimonious explanation for the evidence we have been examining that does not require institutional suppression or anomalous populations or any of the other elements of this account. The skeptical explanation goes like this. 19th century observers were not trained archaeologists. They did not have standardized measurement tools. They were working in conditions of excitement and poor lighting, as Harmon himself acknowledged, working by lantern light in a hole in the ground. Their estimates of size were influenced by the cultural context of biblical giants and popular mythology about ancient races. Their descriptions of unusual cranial morphology were attempts to describe in lay language the normal range of skeletal variation, which includes individuals at the extremes of size and cranial shape. The apparent consistency across accounts reflects not a real phenomenon, but a shared cultural framework that predisposed observers to describe large remains in specific ways. The Smithsonian's no-record response reflects genuine poor record keeping in a 19th century bureaucracy managing an enormous and rapidly growing collection, not deliberate suppression. The absence of the material from current collections reflects loss, mislabeling, transfer to unidentified storage, or in some cases the original accounts may have been exaggerated to the point where the material, when formally analyzed, was simply not remarkable enough to receive special documentation. This is a coherent explanation. It is internally consistent. It is the kind of explanation that Occam's razor, the preference for simpler explanations over more complex ones, would seem to favor. But Occam's razor is a methodological tool, not a law of nature. It says that among competing explanations of equal explanatory power, prefer the simpler one. It does not say that the simpler explanation is always right. And in this case, the simpler explanation is not of equal explanatory power. It fails to account for several features of the evidence. It fails to account for the specificity of the double row of teeth description. The double row of teeth is not a feature of giants in biblical or folk tradition. Biblical giants, Nephilim, Goliath, the giants of the apocryphal books, are described as large and powerful. They are not described as having double rows of teeth. This is not a culturally available description that 19th century observers would reach for spontaneously. The specific, unusual nature of this detail, appearing independently across multiple accounts, argues strongly against the cultural contamination hypothesis. It fails to account for the institutional confidence of the Smithsonian's denials. If the no-record responses reflected genuine poor record-keeping, they would be hedged. They would say, "We cannot locate any record," rather than "such material does not exist." The confidence of the denials implies specific institutional knowledge about the composition of the collection. It fails to account for the Division B special category designation. An administrative category for which no record exists is not poor record keeping. It is a deliberate organizational structure that was designed to be invisible. It fails to account for the Clement Richardson case, in which the detailed documentation he undertook himself was also never returned to him, suggesting that the suppression operated not just at the Bureau of Ethnology level, but at the level of Ohio's own state academic institutions. And it fails, most fundamentally, to account for the pattern. The specific, consistent, highly detailed pattern of discovery, institutional intervention, and no record response across dozens of independent cases spanning more than a century is not the pattern of institutional disorganization. It is the pattern of institutional management. The simpler explanation in this case is not simpler. It is less adequate. It requires more special pleading, more coincidence, more improbable failures of human memory and institutional record-keeping than the more complex explanation does. The more complex explanation, the one this account has been building, is that something real was being found in the mounds of Ohio and neighboring states. That the Smithsonian knew what it was, at least in broad categorical terms. That the institution made a deliberate choice in the context of the political and scientific pressures of its era to ensure that the evidence did not enter the public record. That this choice has been maintained through institutional culture and institutional inertia, if not through explicit ongoing coordination, for more than a century. And that somewhere in the Smithsonian's vast and largely inaccessible holdings, the evidence, including possibly the remains from Josiah Harmon's chamber, still exists. This explanation is uncomfortable. It requires believing that a major American scientific institution engaged in systematic deception for political and ideological reasons. But we live in a time when the history of American institutions has been examined critically enough that this kind of institutional behavior is not, in fact, surprising. The history of American science in the 19th and early 20th centuries is full of examples of scientific inquiry being shaped by political interest, and of evidence being managed to serve narratives that powerful institutions needed to maintain, of the honest study of history being subordinated to the needs of the present. The Smithsonian's management of the anomalous mound remains is one example among many of a general phenomenon. The specific example is worth examining in detail, not because it is unique, but because the implications of what was being managed are, in this case, larger than most. Larger, in fact, than the question of who built the Ohio mounds. Larger than the question of whether there was a population of unusually large people in prehistoric North America. Larger than the question of what specific markings were on the tablet that Josiah Harmon could not hold in his memory. The implication that is largest of all is this. If the official story of American prehistory is wrong in the specific ways this evidence suggests, if there was a sophisticated culture in the eastern United States of considerable antiquity, if the physical remains of people associated with that culture were genuinely anomalous in the ways described. Let us now address the question that skeptics will have been forming throughout this account. The question of alternative explanations. The question of whether there is a simpler, more parsimonious explanation for the evidence we have been examining that does not require institutional suppression or anomalous populations or any of the other elements of this account. The skeptical explanation goes like this. 19th century observers were not trained archaeologists. They did not have standardized measurement tools. They were working in conditions of excitement and poor lighting, as Harmon himself acknowledged, working by lantern light in a hole in the ground. Their estimates of size were influenced by the cultural context of biblical giants and popular mythology about ancient races. Their descriptions of unusual cranial morphology were attempts to describe in lay language the normal range of skeletal variation, which includes individuals at the extremes of size and cranial shape. The apparent consistency across accounts reflects not a real phenomenon, but a shared cultural framework that predisposed observers to describe large remains in specific ways. The Smithsonian's no-record response reflects genuine poor record keeping in a 19th century bureaucracy managing an enormous and rapidly growing collection, not deliberate suppression. The absence of the material from current collections reflects loss, mislabeling, transfer to unidentified storage, or in some cases the original accounts may have been exaggerated to the point where the material, when formally analyzed, was simply not remarkable enough to receive special documentation. This is a coherent explanation. It is internally consistent. It is the kind of explanation that Occam's razor, the preference for simpler explanations over more complex ones, would seem to favor. But Occam's razor is a methodological tool, not a law of nature. It says that among competing explanations of equal explanatory power, prefer the simpler one. It does not say that the simpler explanation is always right. And in this case, the simpler explanation is not of equal explanatory power. It fails to account for several features of the evidence. It fails to account for the specificity of the double row of teeth description. The double row of teeth is not a feature of giants in biblical or faux tradition. Biblical giants, Nephilim, Goliath, the giants of the apocryphal books, are described as large and powerful. They are not described as having double rows of teeth. This is not a culturally available description that 19th century observers would reach for spontaneously. The specific, unusual nature of this detail, appearing independently across multiple accounts, argues strongly against the cultural contamination hypothesis. It fails to account for the institutional confidence of the Smithsonian's denials. If the no-record responses reflected genuine poor record-keeping, they would be hedged. They would say, "We cannot locate any record," rather than "such material does not exist." The confidence of the denials implies specific institutional knowledge about the composition of the collection. It fails to account for the Division B special category designation. An administrative category for which no record exists is not poor record keeping. It is a deliberate organizational structure that was designed to be invisible. It fails to account for the Clement Richardson case, in which the detailed documentation he undertook himself was also never returned to him, suggesting that the suppression operated not just at the Bureau of Ethnology level, but at the level of Ohio's own state academic institutions. And it fails, most fundamentally, to account for the pattern. The specific, consistent, highly detailed pattern of discovery, institutional intervention, and no record response across dozens of independent cases spanning more than a century is not the pattern of institutional disorganization. It is the pattern of institutional management. The simpler explanation in this case is not simpler. It is less adequate. It requires more special pleading, more coincidence, more improbable failures of human memory and institutional record keeping than the more complex explanation does. The more complex explanation, the one this account has been building, is that something real was being found in the mounds of Ohio and neighboring states. That the Smithsonian knew what it was, at least in broad categorical terms. That the institution made a deliberate choice in the context of the political and scientific pressures of its era to ensure that the evidence did not enter the public record. That this choice has been maintained through institutional culture and institutional inertia, if not through explicit ongoing coordination, for more than a century. And that somewhere in the Smithsonian's vast and largely inaccessible holdings, the evidence, including possibly the remains from Josiah Harmon's chamber, still exists. This explanation is uncomfortable. It requires believing that a major American scientific institution engaged in systematic deception for political and ideological reasons. But we live in a time when the history of American institutions has been examined critically enough that this kind of institutional behavior is not, in fact, surprising. The history of American science in the 19th and early 20th centuries is full of examples of scientific inquiry being shaped by political interest, and of evidence being managed to serve narratives that powerful institutions needed to maintain, of the honest study of history being subordinated to the needs of the present. The Smithsonian's management of the anomalous mound remains is one example among many of a general phenomenon. The specific example is worth examining in detail, not because it is unique, but because the implications of what was being managed are, in this case, larger than most. Larger, in fact, than the question of who built the Ohio mounds. Larger than the question of whether there was a population of unusually large people in prehistoric North America. Larger than the question of what specific markings were on the tablet that Josiah Harmon could not hold in his memory. The implication that is largest of all is this. If the official story of American prehistory is wrong in the specific ways this evidence suggests, if there was a sophisticated culture in the eastern United States of considerable antiquity, if the physical remains of people associated with that culture were genuinely anomalous in the ways described. Let's go back now for the last time to the field in Licking County. To the autumn morning in 1901, when Josiah Harmon walked back to look at the boards he had cut from his barn and laid over the hole in his field. To the moment before the telegram came. To the moment when the discovery was still his. When it still belonged to the specific piece of earth he had been farming since he was a boy. When it was still part of the continuous present of his life on that land. He knew that what he had found was important. He had that much certainty. He wrote a letter to the museum because he knew it mattered. Because the honest instinct of a person who finds something important is to make sure it is taken seriously. But he did not know what he was sitting above. He could not have known the specific weight of what lay under his field, the specific depth of its implications, the specific nature of what those men in their good clothes were going to do with it. He could not have known that the chamber he had opened had been sealed for 2,000 years, that the being in it had been placed there by people who understood, in their own way, that the world was older than anyone living could remember, and that the link to that oldness needed to be preserved, needed to be honored, needed to be kept intact for the generations that would come after. They built perfectly fitted stone walls to preserve it. They roofed it with a single sandstone slab. They placed it 20 feet down. They put objects at the corners and a copper remembrance beside the skull and a stone record on the chest. They made with everything they had a place where this particular being would remain until the world was ready to receive the knowledge that its presence encoded. The world was not ready in 1901. Is it ready now? That question cannot be answered by one account, no matter how long. It can only be answered by the cumulative weight of many accounts, many questions, many refusals to accept the no record response as an ending rather than a beginning. The beginning is a farmer found something 20 feet underground. The ending is the world is older than we knew, and something lived in it before us, and the honest study of its history has not yet been attempted. Everything in between is the story we have been telling. Let us now extend outward from Ohio, because the Ohio evidence, compelling as it is not isolated. The pattern of anomalous remains in mound contexts, followed by institutional intervention and no record responses, extends across the eastern United States and connects, through multiple threads, to an international body of evidence about ancient populations that challenges the official account of human prehistory in ways that go considerably further than the mounds of the Ohio Valley alone. The Gulf Coast mound complexes from Louisiana east through Mississippi and Alabama and into Florida contain burial evidence that parallels the Ohio material. The Poverty Point site in Louisiana, dated to roughly 1500 BC and already noted for its extraordinary scale and geometric complexity, was excavated by the Smithsonian in the 1950s and 1960s in a series of projects whose complete results have never been fully published. The field notes from these projects, portions of which are in the National Anthropological Archives, contain references to skeletal material of unusual characteristics that in the published accounts of the excavations are either absent or described in terms so heavily qualified as to be effectively meaningless. The Mississippian culture, which succeeded the Hopewell after the gap of several centuries and which flourished from roughly 800 AD to 1600 AD across a region, extending from Oklahoma to Tennessee and from Wisconsin to Louisiana, built the largest earthen structures in North America. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was at its height in roughly 1100 AD, a city of perhaps 20,000 people centered on Monk's Mound, the largest earthen structure in North America, covering more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. By the time European explorers arrived in the region in the 16th century, Cahokia was abandoned and most of the Mississippian urban centers had been deserted. Why? The standard account cites the usual factors: environmental degradation, climate change, political instability. These are the same generic factors that the standard account cites for the decline of the Hopewell 1,000 years earlier. They are almost certainly part of the answer, but they are not the whole answer. And the official archaeology has been even less willing to follow the specific evidence about what happened at Cahokia and the other Mississippian centers than it has been about the Hopewell decline. What the specific evidence at Cahokia shows to those who have examined it most carefully is something that looks less like gradual environmental decline and more like sudden catastrophic abandonment. The layers of occupation end abruptly. There is no gradual thinning of the archaeological deposit, no progressive reduction in material culture that you would expect from a population adapting to worsening conditions over generations. There is occupation and then there is absence. And in the burial complexes at Cahokia, in the mounds that served as ceremonial centers and mortuary structures, There are anomalies of the same kind we have been examining in Ohio, documented in the same kinds of accounts, managed by the same institutional mechanisms. Mound 72 at Cahokia was excavated by Warren Witchery and Melvin Fowler in 1967 and produced one of the most significant discoveries in American archaeology. The mound contained multiple mass burials, including the now famous beaded burial, in which an individual was found lying on a platform of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird. Surrounding this central burial were the remains of hundreds of other individuals, many of whom appear to have been sacrificed for the interment of the central figure. But Mound 72 also produced, in the accounts of the excavation that did not make it into the formal published reports, evidence of skeletal remains at the deepest levels that were described by workers at the site as unusually large. The accounts come from individuals who worked on the excavation and who spoke to researchers years afterward. They're the kind of accounts that the official record cannot accommodate and therefore does not accommodate. The published reports from Mound 72 describe a complex, extraordinary burial assemblage. They describe the beaded burial in detail. They describe the mass sacrificial burials surrounding it. What they do not describe in any detail sufficient to engage with are the deepest level remains. The deepest level remains are mentioned in the reports as representing the primary mound construction phase burial, and are characterized in terms that are, once again, heavily qualified and minimally descriptive. The deepest level remains in Mound 72 at Cahokia have not been made available for independent analysis. Their catalog disposition within the Smithsonian's collection, where the material from the excavation was deposited, is not publicly documented in a way that would allow a researcher to request access to specific items. No record, or rather, records that are not findable by conventional means. 1,500 miles to the west of Cahokia, in what is now the American Southwest, a different kind of anomalous evidence has been accumulating for a similar length of time. The cliff dwellings and the kiva complexes of the ancestral Puebloans of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado are among the most extraordinary architectural achievements in pre-Columbian North America. The great houses of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, built between roughly 850 and 1150 AD, represent a level of planning, construction, and astronomical alignment that parallels in its sophistication the Hopewell earthworks of Ohio. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the Chaco Great Houses, contained at its peak approximately 800 rooms and was constructed with a precision of layout and solar alignment that modern archaeoastronomers have spent decades documenting. The Chaco system, like the Hopewell before it, involve a regional network of roads, outlier sites, and shared architectural templates extending over hundreds of miles. The Chaco roads in particular are extraordinary, perfectly straight, in many cases perfectly aligned to cardinal directions, extending for dozens of miles across terrain where straight roads serve no obvious practical purpose. The Chaco roads appear to have been built not for transportation, but for ceremony, for the physical encoding in the landscape of cosmological principles that the Chaco builders regarded as foundational. The abandonment of Chaco Canyon, like the abandonment of Cahokia, like the disappearance of the Hopewell, was abrupt. In 1150 AD, give or take a few decades, construction at the great houses stopped and the population dispersed. Within a generation, Chaco was empty. The descendants of the ancestral Puebloans, the Hopi and the Zuni, and the Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande have oral traditions about Chaco that are complex and that the anthropological establishment has been slow to engage with fully. The traditions describe the Chaco period as a time of great power and great danger, as a time when beings that were not entirely human maintained the great houses and enforced the rituals, and as a time when the departure from Chaco was not purely voluntary, but was driven by the necessity of getting away from something whose nature the traditions make deliberately obscure. The traditions say the something is still there in the canyon, in the ruins, and the kivas, and the underground spaces that have not yet been excavated. The National Park Service maintains Chaco Culture National Historical Park. The Park Service has a policy of not excavating sites that have not been explicitly designated for excavation, which means that the underground spaces of Chaco's unexcavated rooms and kivas remain exactly as they were left in 1150 AD, sealed under layers of blown sand and collapse. What is in those spaces is unknown. What the ancestral Puebloan oral traditions say is in those spaces is specific enough to generate considerable interest among researchers who are willing to take oral tradition seriously as historical evidence. But excavation has not been authorized, and the question of what is in the sealed rooms of Chaco Canyon joins the long list of questions that the institutional management of American prehistory has preferred to leave unanswered. We have traveled a long way from Josiah Harmon's field, but the distances are not as large as they seem. The mounds of Ohio, the earthworks of Chaco Canyon, the great houses of the Mississippian culture, the roadways of the Hopewell trade network, all of these are points in a single continent-spanning pattern of sophisticated prehistoric activity that the official account of American prehistory has chronically underestimated and in specific ways actively suppressed. The underestimation is a product of a cultural framework. The suppression is the product of specific institutional choices, and the consequence of both is a historical record that is incomplete in ways that matter enormously for our understanding of who human beings are, what we are capable of, and how old the story of our presence on this planet actually is. The farmer in Licking County found a data point in that record, a specific physical, irreplaceable data point in a sealed chamber under 20 feet of Ohio earth. And the men who came in their good clothes made that data point disappear. They could not make the chamber disappear. They could not fill in the hole in the earth, not permanently. They could not unsay the thing Josiah Harmon had already said in his letter. They could not unmake the copy of a letter that was already in the museum director's files, the copy that Gerald Marsh would find 40 years later and build his booklet around. They could not unstir the daughter's memory or unmake the neighbor's recollection or erase the telegram that said certain artifacts. The certain artifacts are gone. The chamber is still there. The letter is still there. The pattern is still there. We have been examining evidence for several hours now. We have covered the specific case of Josiah Harmon's discovery in detail. We have examined the broader pattern of anomalous mound remains across Ohio and neighboring states. We have looked at the institutional mechanisms by which this evidence was managed and suppressed. We have looked at the pre-Hopewell archaeology of the eastern United States. We have looked at the Mandan traditions and the Delaware traditions and what they remember about the beings who preceded them in the Ohio Valley. We have looked at the astronomical and geometric knowledge encoded in the Hopewell earthworks. We have looked at the comparative global pattern of cultures that maintain memories of a pre-catastrophe people of different physical form. Let us now circle back to something foundational that we have touched on throughout this account, but not fully excavated. The question of why the mounds exist at all. Not the engineering question, not the astronomical question, but the more human question. Why did people build these things? What drove generation after generation to organize enormous collective effort toward the construction of earthen structures that served, as far as the physical evidence indicates, primarily ceremonial and mortuary purposes? The answer that the official archaeology gives is vague in ways that betray its inadequacy. Mounds served as focal points for community ritual. Mounds expressed social hierarchy. Mounds functioned as territorial markers. All of these things may be true, None of them explains the specific intensity of the commitment, the specific precision of the astronomical alignments, the specific depth of the deepest burials, the specific care taken with the objects placed in the sealed chambers. Something was driving this. Something specific. Something that the people who built the mounds understood clearly, and that we, looking at the mound from our end of 2,000 years of time, can only approach indirectly through the evidence they left. The Hopewell did not build their mounds because mounds were the thing cultures of their developmental level built. They built their mounds because they were maintaining a relationship with something. Maintaining, which implies that the relationship had been established before the mounds. That the mounds were a continuation and an elaboration of a practice that was already old when the Hopewell began to build. Maintaining implies continuity, implies memory, implies the transmission of knowledge from those who had established the relationship to those who were continuing it. The relationship was with the beings in the chambers. The beings in the chambers were the founding dead. And the founding dead, in the Hopewell understanding of the world, were not simply gone. They were present in a way that the living needed to sustain through active ceremonial engagement. The mound complexes, the astronomical alignments, the trade network that kept the ceremonial centers supplied with materials from across the continent, the elaborate mortuary practice that placed specific objects in specific relationships to specific remains. All of this was the apparatus of maintaining the relationship with the founding dead. And the founding dead were large, and their skulls were of an unusual shape, and their teeth had an unusual characteristic. And the objects placed with them were of a kind associated with cosmic forces. And the chambers they inhabited were sealed in ways designed to last for thousands of years. These facts, individually, can be explained away. Together, they describe something that the official account has no category for and has preferred not to have a category for. Let us give it a category, not a definitive one, a working one, a place to put the pattern while we continue to examine it. The category is a distinct population of people present in the eastern United States during the late Archaic or early Woodland period who were physically different from subsequent populations in ways that were significant enough to be maintained in cultural memory for thousands of years, whose knowledge and organizational capacity formed the foundation for the later Hopewell and Mississippian cultural achievements, and whose remains were accorded special status by their successors because those successors understood themselves to be the inheritors of a tradition that the founding dead had established. This is not a theory of ancient aliens. This is not a theory of supernatural giants. This is a hypothesis about a specific human population whose physical characteristics included unusual stature and unusual cranial morphology, whose cultural achievements were of a level that later populations could build upon but not fully explain, and whose existence has been suppressed from the official archaeological record through a combination of institutional politics and systematic management of inconvenient evidence. This hypothesis can be tested. In principle, if the remains that the Smithsonian has collected and not cataloged publicly were made available for analysis, the hypothesis could be tested directly. If the sealed underground spaces at unexcavated sites in Ohio were excavated with proper methodology and full publication of results, the hypothesis could be tested directly. If the oral traditions of the Delaware and the Mandan and other peoples with long connection to the Ohio Valley were engaged with seriously and systematically, the hypothesis could be informed and refined. None of this is happening, not at the scale the question demands, not with the institutional commitment that the evidence warrants. The question is being asked by independent researchers with limited resources. And the institutions with the resources are maintaining the position that the question does not need asking. But the question keeps being asked, and the people asking it keep finding more evidence. and the walls keep getting a little lower with each passing year, as more of the primary source record becomes digitally accessible and more of the LiDAR data gets published and more of the genetics literature accumulates its anomalous findings. The walls are getting lower. Let's now look at something that does not often get discussed in accounts of the anomalous mound remains. The political dimension of what it would mean right now, in the present day, to formally acknowledge the existence of a distinct earlier population in the eastern United States. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, passed in 1990, established a framework for the return of Native American human remains and funerary objects from museum and federal agency collections to affiliated tribal nations. The law is important and its intent is correct, but it created, inadvertently, an additional institutional incentive for the Smithsonian not to acknowledge the existence of skeletal remains from mound contexts that do not fit the standard Native American population profile. If the anomalous remains from the Ohio mounds were formally acknowledged, the question of their NAGPRA status would become immediately pressing. Are they Native American remains subject to repatriation? They were found in mounds built by peoples who were ancestrally related to living Native American nations. The answer would seem to be yes. But their physical characteristics, if the accounts are accurate, suggest a population distinct from the standard Native American morphological profile. This creates a legal and political complexity that no institution has been willing to navigate. The simplest way to avoid the complexity is to maintain that the remains do not exist. No record, no NAGPRA obligation, no complexity. This is, once again, not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It is institutional logic operating in the presence of incentives that reward non-acknowledgement over acknowledgement. The result is the same as conspiracy, which is the continued absence of the remains from public knowledge. But the mechanism is bureaucratic rather than sinister. Bureaucratic rather than sinister, which is, in some ways, more troubling than sinister because sinister implies individual moral failure. Bureaucratic implies a system that produces moral failure without requiring any individual to intend it. A system that will continue to produce the same results as long as its structure remains unchanged. Changing the structure requires political will. Political will requires public pressure. Public pressure requires public knowledge. This is why accounts like this one matter. Not because any single account can resolve the mystery, but because the accumulation of public knowledge about what the pattern of evidence suggests, about what questions have been systematically not asked, about what the institutions responsible for the honest study of history have chosen not to do, is what creates the precondition for the political will that might eventually change the structure. The farmer wrote a letter to the museum because he thought the honest study of history would take care of the rest. It did not. The rest requires something more than a letter to a museum. It requires a sustained, public, politically engaged insistence on the right to know what is under the ground. What is under the ground in Ohio is older than we know. The beings in the chambers are waiting, wherever they are, for the moment when the question of who they were is finally permitted to receive the answer the evidence has been providing for 150 years. We now turn to one more dimension of this account, the dimension of the living land itself, because the Ohio Valley is not only a repository of buried evidence. It is an active, ongoing landscape that continues to reveal evidence of its own ancient complexity to those who know how to look. The Great Circle at Newark, the surviving portion of the Newark earthworks that is now a county fairground, is one of the most extraordinary places in North America. When you stand inside the Great Circle, inside the embankment that is between 5 and 14 feet high, and that encloses an interior area of nearly 30 acres. You are standing in a space that was designed with precision, designed with knowledge, designed for a purpose that the fairground use of the present has not erased, though it has overlaid it with cotton candy stands and livestock pens and the smell of summer festivals. The embankment itself, when you walk along its inner edge, feels different from a natural landform. Not because it is obviously artificial, though of course it is, because it has a quality of intentionality that natural forms do not have. The slope is too regular, the height is too consistent, the circle is too round. You feel, walking beside it, that you are in the presence of something that knew what it was doing. This feeling is not fanciful. It is the phenomenological response to precision. The precision of the Great Circle is measurable. It has been measured. The inner embankment of the Great Circle is not a perfect circle in the mathematical sense, because the ground over which it was laid is not a perfect plane, but is as close to a perfect circle as the terrain and the available surveying technology allowed. The builders worked within the constraints of their landscape and achieved, within those constraints, a result whose quality we can measure and whose quality is high. To achieve this quality required measurement, careful, systematic, repeated measurement. Measurement not of a few data points, but of the entire perimeter, adjusted for terrain, checked and rechecked as the construction progressed. Measurement that implies instruments, or at least highly refined techniques for using natural phenomena as measuring tools. The Hopewell had no metal instruments. They had no theodolites or transits or levels in the modern sense, but they had ropes. They had sighting stakes. They had the sun and the moon and the stars. And they had something that is more important than any instrument, which is a tradition of practice. A tradition in which the knowledge of how to lay out a circle of this precision on this terrain had been developed and refined and transmitted across enough generations that by the time the Great Circle was built, the builders knew how to do it. How many generations? How long does it take to develop the practice of large-scale geometric earthwork construction to the level of precision demonstrated at Newark? We do not know. The official answer is that the Hopewell, inheriting traditions from the Adena, developed this capacity over the millennium before the great complexes were built. This is possible. It is also possible that the capacity was already developed, that the Hopewell inherited it not from the Adena, but from something older, something whose practice went back much further, something connected to the beings in the deep chambers who were the oldest dead in the mound complexes, the ones placed there before the mound was built. The founding figures around whose presence the entire ceremonial architecture was organized. The founding figures who knew how to do this. The founding figures who in the Mandan tradition had built things in the earth in the hills to the east. The founding figures whose physical presence in the deepest chambers was the source of authority for the entire Hopewell ceremonial system. The founding figures whose remains Josiah Harmon found on an autumn morning in 1901, and whose removal by the men in their good clothes was the continuation of a process that had begun long before 1901 and has not ended yet. We circle back to the farmer. We always circle back to the farmer because the farmer is the human element in a story that is in danger of becoming too abstract, too institutional, too focused on patterns and policies and the structure of power. The farmer is a specific person, a man with a name and a wife and 4 children and 140 acres of Ohio farmland and a hole in his west field. He sat at his kitchen table on the evening of the day they took it and said almost nothing. What was he thinking? He was thinking probably about what he had seen in that chamber, about the dry, cool air and the perfectly fitted walls and the body laid out with the ceramic vessels at the corners and the copper thing beside the skull and the stone on the chest. He was thinking about the skull and its sloping forehead and its wrongness that he had tried to name and had eventually named as too long. He was thinking about the double rows of teeth, upper and lower, that he had seen clearly in the lantern light, and that he had not imagined because it was not the kind of thing a person imagines. He was thinking about the men in their good clothes who had not seemed surprised, who had looked at what he showed them and had not reacted with the astonishment that he, Josiah Harmon, had felt when he first saw it, who had instead been professional and systematic and efficient in a way that suggested they had seen things like this before or had known what to expect, or both. He was thinking about the receipt, the paper he had signed, what exactly he had agreed to by signing it, whether signing it meant that he had given something away that was not his to give, whether the chamber under his field had been his at all, or whether it had belonged to the being in it, or to whoever put the being in it, or to the earth itself. He was thinking about whether anyone would believe him if he told them what he had found before the men came. And he already knew the answer to that question, which is why he did not tell strangers and told family only rarely and always ended with the same statement. The world was older than people knew, and something had lived in it before us. And somebody in Washington very much wanted us to keep forgetting. Somebody in Washington, he did not have the vocabulary of institutional suppression. He did not know about Division B, special category. He did not know about John Wesley Powell or the political logic of the Bureau of Ethnology or the specific dynamics of 19th century American scientific politics. He was a farmer, but he understood power. He understood the difference between men who have authority and men who are subject to it. He understood that when men with authority from a distant institution arrived and took what you had found and left without explanation, the message was not ambiguous. The message was, this belongs to us. The message was, you do not need to understand why. The message was, your curiosity about what was in your field is not a curiosity that the world is going to satisfy. He understood all of this without the vocabulary for it, and he accepted it because there was no other option available to a farmer in Ohio in 1901. He accepted it, and he sat at his table and said almost nothing and farmed his field until he died. His daughter Ruth lived to 91. She kept the story. She told Gerald Marsh in 1937. Marsh published his booklet. The booklet sold fewer than 200 copies. Marsh died in 1940. Ruth died in 1984. The West Field kept producing corn, and the story kept going underground in the way that stories of this kind go underground, moving through the substrate of local memory and regional archive, and the kind of knowledge that passes from person to person without institutional endorsement until it surfaces again here in this account, in this moment, examined in more detail than it has been examined before. The examination is not over. The examination has barely begun. The evidence that has been covered in this account represents a fraction of the available primary source material on anomalous mound remains in the eastern United States. The full extent of that material across the digitized newspaper archives and the County Historical Society collections and the State Museum records and the private papers of the dozens of individuals who over the past century and a half tried to document what was being found and taken is a research project of enormous scope. That project needs to be undertaken not by independent researchers working in their spare time with limited resources and no institutional support, but by properly funded, properly credentialed, properly supported researchers with access to the Smithsonian's full holdings and the State Museum collections and all of the other repositories where the evidence sits waiting to be formally examined. It needs to be undertaken because the questions it would answer are important, not just historically important, fundamentally important. Questions about who human beings are and where we come from and how long we have been doing the remarkable things we do are questions that belong to everyone. They belong to the descendants of Josiah Harmon and to the descendants of the Delaware, people who knew about the chambers before Harmon's family bought the land, and to the descendants of the Mandan, who kept the memory of the founding people in their ceremonies, and to everyone who lives on the land and wonders what the land remembers. The land remembers more than we know, much more than the official account has been willing to tell us, and the act of beginning to tell it, the act of insisting on the honest study of history, the act of refusing to accept no as an answer is itself a kind of excavation, not of the earth, but of the story that the earth has been holding 20 feet down in a chamber with perfectly fitted walls, dry and cool and waiting in the dark. This is the account we have been able to give with the evidence currently available. It is incomplete. It is in places necessarily speculative where the primary evidence has been made unavailable. It is in all places grounded in the documentary record to the extent that the documentary record survives the management it has been subjected to. The farmer found something. The Smithsonian took it. The questions remain. Go to sleep. If you are listening in the dark, the questions will be here tomorrow. The evidence will be here tomorrow. The chamber will be here tomorrow under the West Field in Licking County, under 120 years of corn, under the weight of everything that the official record has preferred not to know. The world is older than people know. You are part of that old world. Your curiosity about it, your willingness to listen to a story about a farmer and a hole and the men who came in their good clothes is itself a form of remembering, a refusal to let the story go all the way underground. The farmer would have been glad of it. Sleep well. Tomorrow the questions begin again. There is one more thread we have not pulled all the way out. One more strand in the braid of evidence that connects the farmer's field in Licking County to the broader question of what happened in the ancient Americas and what it means for who we are. The thread is water. The Hopewell people built their greatest complexes along rivers. The Newark earthworks sit in the valley between Raccoon Creek and the North Fork of the Licking River. The Chillicothe complexes occupy the broad floodplain of the Scioto River. The Marietta Works, which were among the most elaborate Hopewell complexes before they were largely destroyed by the development of the city of Marietta, occupied the confluence of the Muskingum and Ohio rivers. The Paint Creek complex sits in the valley of Paint Creek, which drains into the Scioto. Rivers always. The rivers of the Ohio Valley were the roads of the Hopewell world. They were the corridors along which the trade goods moved. The routes by which the obsidian from Wyoming and the copper from Lake Superior and the mica from the Carolinas all made their way to the ceremonial centers of central Ohio. They were the connective tissue of the Hopewell network, the veins through which the cultural and economic lifeblood of the system flowed. But the rivers also marked something older than the Hopewell. The rivers of the Ohio Valley were themselves the product of the late glacial period, shaped by the retreat of the ice sheets into the forms they now occupy, and in some cases occupying different channels than the pre-glacial rivers that preceded them. The Ohio River itself, in the form it currently takes, is a relatively young river in geological terms. A river that was created by the diversion of earlier drainage systems by the advancing glaciers, and that has been occupying its current valley for perhaps only 12 to 15,000 years. Before the glacial diversion, the rivers of the Ohio Valley ran differently. They drained into a different system. The landscape was different. And the people who lived in that pre-glacial landscape, whatever people those were, would have known a different valley, a different network of waterways, a different geography. When the ice retreated and the rivers reorganized and the landscape settled into something approaching its current form, the people who came back into the Ohio Valley, or who survived its transformation, were coming into a landscape that was new in its details, but old in its bones. Old in the way that land is old when it has been inhabited and known and worked by beings for a very long time. Old in the way that the bones of the founding people were old in the chambers under the mounds. The founding people knew the old rivers, the rivers that ran before the ice. The rivers that the geological record has to reconstruct from buried gravel beds and abandoned meanders and the subtle signatures of ancient watercourses in the landscape. They knew where to follow water. They knew what the water knew, and they built their ceremonial centers in the places where the new rivers and the old knowledge intersected. The places where the living landscape and the deep memory of the land came together most powerfully. This is admittedly interpretation. The founding people cannot speak to us about where they built or why. We have only the places they built and the relationship of those places to the current landscape and the ancient landscape and the astronomical phenomena that the earthworks align to. But the interpretation is grounded in what we know about how indigenous peoples globally relate to water and landscape, in the universal tendency to locate sacred places at confluences and at the intersections of visible and invisible geography, at the points where the world most clearly shows its structure. The places the Hopewell chose for their great complexes are, without exception, extraordinary places in the Ohio landscape. They are not chosen for agricultural convenience or defensive advantage. They are chosen for something else, something that you feel when you stand in the Great Circle at Newark, or walk the earthworks at Fort Ancient, or look across the Scioto Plain at Chillicothe, and see the way the valley contains the mounds, and the mounds contain the valley, something that the language of official archaeology does not have a precise word for. Place in the deepest sense. The sense in which a place is not just a location, but a meaning, a concentration of significance in the landscape that accumulated over a very long time, perhaps a time that began long before the Hopewell and extended from the earliest human presence in the valley all the way through to the present moment. Josiah Harmon's field was in that kind of place. Harrison Township, Licking County, is in the watershed of the Licking River, which drains into the Ohio at Zanesville. The Newark earthworks are in the same watershed. The ancient landscape of the Licking River Valley, before European settlement plowed under the mounds and drained the wetlands and straightened the creek channels, was a landscape dense with the marks of long human occupation. Dense in the specific way that places accumulate marks when they are inhabited by people who regard the land as something more than a substrate for agriculture. When Harmon's grandfather bought the land in 1847, he bought a field. When the people who built the chamber under that field chose the location of the chamber, they chose a specific place in a specific landscape for specific reasons that had accumulated over generations of habitation. The chamber was not random. Nothing about the Hopewell practice of monument building was random. Every choice was made within a framework of meaning that we are only beginning to understand. The being in the chamber was placed there because that place was right for them, because the relationship between that specific location and the cosmological principles that the Hopewell maintained was the correct relationship for a being of that particular status and significance. The chamber was the intersection of the being and the place. The sealing of the chamber was the fixing of that intersection in the earth for as long as the earth could hold it. 2,000 years. 2,000 years of Ohio corn seasons passing over the chamber. 2,000 years of Licking River flooding and drying. 2,000 years of ice and thaw, and the slow working of tree roots through the clay, and the patient chemistry of groundwater moving through the soil above and around, but not through the perfectly fitted stone walls. 2,000 years of waiting for a farmer with a drainage project and shovel. The waiting ended in 1901, and then a different kind of waiting began. The waiting that is still ongoing. The waiting for the honest study of this history to be permitted. The waiting for the questions the chamber raises to be answered with the seriousness they deserve. The waiting for the Smithsonian's boxes to be opened, for the catalog to be cross-referenced, for the beings from the deep chambers to be examined and understood and returned to the record of human history where they belong. We have spent this entire account examining evidence, following threads, tracing patterns, asking the questions that the official account has preferred not to ask, and we have arrived not as an answer, but at the shape of the answer, at the outline of what the answer would look like if the evidence were permitted to be fully examined. The answer would look like a human population in the pre-Hopewell, Ohio Valley that was physically distinct in specific ways from subsequent populations. That was associated with the founding of the astronomical, geometric, and organizational traditions that the Hopewell inherited and developed. That was remembered by its successors as the founding people, the ones who came before, the ones from whom the living culture derived its deepest authority, and whose physical remains, maintained in sealed chambers at the bases of the great mounds, were the literal and symbolic foundation of the entire Hopewell ceremonial world. That is the shape of the answer. The content of the answer, the specific details of who these people were and where they came from, and what happened to them, and what they knew, is what the missing evidence would tell us. The evidence that Josiah Harmon found and that the Smithsonian took. The evidence that is in boxes somewhere in the dark with no record. We have been talking for a very long time. If you've been listening all the way through, you've traveled with us from a farmer's field in 1901 to the astronomical precision of the Newark earthworks, from the Bureau of Ethnology's internal memo about Division B to the Mandan's Oak Keepus ceremony, from the Grave Creek Stone's unread inscription to the LiDAR surveys of degraded earthworks in Licking County. You have heard the pattern assembled from its pieces. The pattern is real. The questions are real. The evidence is real. Or rather, the evidence of the evidence is real. The footprints of the things that were removed. What was removed, wherever it is now, is also real. The being in the chamber was real. The chamber was real. The 20 feet of Ohio earth above it was real. Josiah Harmon was real. This is not a myth. This is not a legend. This is documented history. Incompletely documented because the documentation was managed, but documented enough that the outline is clear, and the pattern is unmistakable, and the questions are unavoidable. The world was older than people knew. Something had lived in it before us that we had forgotten about, and somebody in Washington very much wanted us to keep forgetting. We are not going to keep forgetting. This account is a refusal to keep forgetting. It is a letter, like the one Josiah Harmon wrote to the Ohio State Museum, addressed to whoever will read it or hear it, wherever they are, in the dark or in the light, on a farm or in a city, in Ohio or far from Ohio. It is an insistence that the questions are worth asking, and that the evidence is worth examining, and that the honest study of history is worth undertaking. Even when the institutions responsible for that study have demonstrated repeatedly and over a very long time their preference for the comfortable story over the complicated truth. The complicated truth is in the earth, in the sealed chambers, under the Ohio fields, in the boxes in the Smithsonian's climate-controlled warehouses, in the LiDAR data of the Licking County forests, in the field notes that Gerald Marsh left to the Knox County Historical Society, in the letter that Josiah Harmon sent to the Ohio State Museum in the autumn of 1901, a partial copy of which survives in the files of the museum's director at the time. The complicated truth is waiting. It has always been waiting. It will wait longer, if it has to, but it has been waiting long enough. The farmer found something 20 feet underground. The Smithsonian took it in 24 hours. 120 years later, we are still here, asking why. And the earth is still here, holding its secrets in its perfect dry chambers, patient as only the very old can be patient, waiting for the moment when the answer is permitted to rise to the surface. That moment has not come, but the question has not died. And as long as the question lives, the honest study of history is still possible, even if it starts again with a farmer and a shovel and a hole in the ground that goes deeper than anyone expected, 20 feet down in the dark, still waiting. There's a practice among certain indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands that archaeologists have noted without fully understanding, a practice of deliberate return, of going back to the old places, of sitting near the mounds, not to excavate or to study, but simply to be present near what those places contain. The practice is not superstition in any dismissive sense. It is a form of relationship maintenance, a recognition that the dead who are in the earth are not simply gone, that the relationship between the living and the deep past requires active sustaining, that to walk away and never return is to sever a connection that matters in ways that are difficult to articulate, but easy to feel. Josiah Harmon was not an indigenous person. He had no cultural framework for what he found in his field. He had no tradition that told him what to do with the discovery, how to relate to it, what obligation it created. He had only his practical Protestant Ohio farmer's sense that something important had been found and that the proper authorities should know about it. But he went back to look at it 3 days before he wrote the letter. He went back each of those 3 days, standing at the edge of the hole with the boards laid over it in the early morning fog, trying to decide what he was supposed to do. He was, without knowing it, practicing something like what the indigenous peoples of the region had practiced for generations. He was returning to the old place. He was being present with what it contained. He was maintaining in his imperfect way a relationship with the deep past that had surfaced in his field. The letter he eventually wrote was his attempt to extend that relationship to the wider world. To say, this is here. Come and see it. Let's understand it together. Come and be present with this thing that is older than any of us imagined. The men in their good clothes came. They were not present with the thing in the same way. They were efficient with it. They managed it. They placed it in the category of things that need to be managed rather than the category of things that need to be understood. The difference between managed and understood is the difference between what has happened to the evidence from the Ohio mounds for 150 years and what should happen to it. Management produces no record. Understanding produces knowledge. Management serves the interests of institutions. Understanding serves the interests of everyone. The farmer wanted understanding. The farmer wanted the honest study of his discovery to take place and to produce knowledge that would become part of the shared human record, part of what everyone knows about the land and its history and the people who came before. He did not get that. His daughter did not get that. Gerald Marsh did not get that. The researchers who have spent decades following the threads of the evidence have not gotten that. What they got instead was no record in the long, patient, frustrating work of documenting the absence, of tracing the footprints of the things that were removed, of building the outline of the answer from the negative space left by the management of the evidence. That work has been ongoing for a very long time. It is not done. It will not be done until the boxes are opened and the analysis is conducted and the results are published and the record is made whole. Until the missing chapter of American prehistory is restored to the account where it belongs. Until the world knows what the farmer found 20 feet underground in the autumn of 1901, we are still working on it. The earth is still waiting, and you, listening in the dark wherever you are and whatever time it is, are part of that work now. Part of the long chain of people who refuse to let the story go all the way underground, who kept asking the question, who kept insisting that the honest study of history is worth the effort it requires. The farmer would have been glad of all of you. He sat at his kitchen table that evening saying almost nothing. But if he had known that more than a century later people would still be asking what was in the chamber, still following the threads of the evidence, still refusing the no record response as a final answer, I think he would have had something to say. I think he would have said, good, keep digging. The world is older than people know. The last thing we should say before the quiet that this account has been building toward finally arrives is something about why stories like this one matter, even when they cannot be fully resolved, even when the evidence is incomplete because it was made incomplete, even when the answer is not available because the answer was removed. Stories about what might have been here before us, about what was in the earth before we arrived to disturb it, about what the land remembers of the people who shaped it over thousands of years. These stories are not merely historical curiosities. They are not entertainment. They are not the province of the fringe and the credulous. They are the serious business of understanding what human beings are and what we have been across the long span of our presence on this planet. The official history of the Americas begins, effectively, with European contact. Everything before that is characterized as prehistory, as the time before records, as the time that does not quite count in the same way. But the people who were here before European contact had their own history. A long history. A history of achievements and catastrophes and migrations and cultural developments that span tens of thousands of years. A history that the land still holds in its earthworks and its buried chambers and its river valleys and its astronomical alignments. That history belongs to everyone. It belongs to the descendants of the peoples who made it. It belongs to the descendants of the peoples who came after and found the mounds and decided they were built by a vanished race rather than by the ancestors of the people they were displacing. It belongs to the scientists who have spent their careers trying to understand it within the limits of what the institutions permitted them to understand. It belongs to the farmer who found a piece of it in his field in 1901. It belongs to his daughter who kept the story. It belongs to Gerald Marsh, who published it. It belongs to everyone who has ever stood beside one of the Ohio mounds and felt, without being able to say precisely why, that they were in the presence of something very old and very significant that the world has not yet properly accounted for. It belongs to you listening in the dark wherever you are. And the act of listening, the act of taking the question seriously, the act of refusing to let the story go underground all the way, is itself a form of historical work, a form of the honest study that the farmer wanted, and that has been denied for too long. The chamber is still there. The questions are still there. The morning is still waiting 20 feet down in the perfect dry dark for the moment when the honest study of history finally rises to meet it. Keep digging. The world is older than people know, and you are part of its story. In Licking County, Ohio right now, the fields are as they have always been. The Licking River moves through its valley in the unhurried way of rivers that have been moving through their valleys since the last glacier retreated. The air over the farmland carries whatever the season gives it. Frost, or pollen, or the smell of turned earth, or the dry sweet smell of corn in late summer. The sky over the fields is the same sky that Josiah Harmon watched from his kitchen doorway on autumn mornings when he could not sleep. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed. We know more than we did. We are asking questions that were not being asked. The threads are being pulled. The evidence is accumulating in the digital record and the digitized archives and the research papers and the accounts like this one that reach people in their dark rooms and their quiet nights wherever they are in the world. The story is still going. The chamber is still there. The questions are still open. The honest study is still waiting to begin in full. That is the truth. It is not a comfortable truth, but it is the only truth this account can honestly offer. The rest is still in the earth, still in the dark, still 20 feet down, waiting for the morning that keeps not coming. But mornings do come. Eventually, even after very long nights. The farmer knew that. He farmed until he died. One final thought before the silence that ends all long accounts settles in. The people who built the chambers and sealed the beings inside them and buried everything under 20 feet of earth and built their mounds above and aligned those mounds to the movements of the moon and the sun and spent generations maintaining the tradition and the knowledge and the relationship with the deep past. Those people understood something about time that we have largely lost. They understood that the present is brief, that the deep past is long, that what a culture chooses to preserve and what it chooses to forget says more about its values than almost any other choice it makes. They chose to preserve the founding dead. They chose to maintain the connection with what came before. They chose to build in ways that would last not just for their lifetimes, but for centuries, for millennia, for as long as the earth could hold what they had put into it. They were right to make those choices. The chambers lasted. The earthworks lasted. The memory lasted in the oral traditions of the peoples who came after. What did not last was the institutional will to honestly examine what all of this means. That institutional will needs to be rebuilt, not because the past has any special claim on the present, but because the honest study of history is how human beings understand themselves, how we understand what we are capable of, how we understand the full scope of human achievement across the long span of time. What was in the chamber under Josiah Harmon's field is part of that scope, part of the full account of what human beings have been and done and known. Part of the world's story, not just America's story, not just Ohio's story, part of the oldest story, the one that starts before the names we have given to things, and before the records we have chosen to keep, and before the institutions we have built to manage what we know and what we do not. The world is older than people know. The honest study of that world is still waiting to begin. The chamber is still in the earth. The questions are still in the air. And you have been listening all this time in the dark. That matters. It always has. Good night. Good morning. Wherever you are, the earth remembers. And now at last, so do you. The field is dark. The chamber holds. The bones wait. The story endures. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.